In the heart of Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, lies Lancaster City. A place filled with a rich history, bustling markets, and enchanting Amish countryside. The city was known for its vibrant downtown, brimming with art galleries, quirky boutiques, and an array of restaurants serving everything from farm-to-table meals to hearty Pennsylvania Dutch fare. But its beauty did not end at the city limits. The suburbs that skirted Lancaster City were as picturesque as they came, offering a slice of American suburbia that was idyllic, to say the least. Tight-knit communities thrived in towns like Leeds, known for its quaint Main Street and annual festivals, or Ephrata, with its majestic cloister and peaceful park. Further out, the rolling farmland was a sight to behold, a patchwork of fields that stretched out in all directions, punctuated by the occasional farmhouse or Amish buggy. Among the city's denizens was a man named Johnny Vanjuk. He wasn't much to look at, his years on the street showing on his weathered face and tattered clothes. Johnny had a home, of sorts, in the old derelict Staley Silk Mill on Martha Avenue, a colossal structure that once hummed with the sound of looms but now was just an eerie quiet broken only by the occasional dripping water or Johnny's footfall. As much as anyone could say, Johnny Vanjuk was just another homeless person in Lancaster City. But Johnny was more than that. Johnny was a survivor. Back in the heart of Lancaster City, life continued as usual, the air heavy with the scent of pretzels and horse manure, a peculiar combination that was as comforting as it was distinctive. At the city's schools, children ran amok in playgrounds while teenagers huddled together in cliques, engrossed in hushed whispers and stolen glances. Lancaster Mennonite, Mannheim Township, McCaskey High, these schools were the epicenter of youth, hope, and boundless energy. Ruby Street, a cobblestone path hugged by row houses with wooden porches and blooming flower boxes, was just a heartbeat away from the bustling downtown. In one such house lived the Brenneman family. Their story was not unlike many others in Lancaster. The patriarch, Samuel, was a teacher at the local high school, and his wife, Sarah, managed the town's beloved bakery. They lived with their 3 children, quietly cherishing the peace that their close-knit community offered. But this tranquility would soon come under threat. The first sign was small, barely a blip on the radar. An unusual flu had spread through Ruby Street. It started with the Brennemans' youngest, a sweet-faced boy named Timothy. He complained of fatigue, of aches, of an insatiable hunger. It wasn't long before the others on Ruby Street started showing similar symptoms. The local GP, Dr. Simmons, simply diagnosed it as a seasonal flu, advising rest and plenty of fluids. Yet, as days passed, the afflicted showed no signs of recovery. Instead, they seemed to grow progressively worse. Eyes bloodshot, skin as pale as snow, and that ceaseless hunger. On a fateful day, Samuel Brenneman failed to show up at school. When a fellow teacher visited the Brenneman house, she found no family but a scene straight from a horror film. There, the tale of Lancaster City and its quiet life began to turn. The world knew not yet of the storm that brewed in the heart of Amish country. But it would soon. It would soon. In the days following the gruesome discovery at the Brenneman residence, a veil of uncertainty and fear descended upon Lancaster City. The local police, ill-prepared for such a case, reached out to the state authorities. But, with limited evidence and no witnesses, progress was slow. At first, it was thought to be an isolated incident, a macabre tragedy, but soon other households started reporting similar horrifying scenes. It wasn't just Ruby Street anymore, it was Walnut Street, then Prince Street, and so forth. An inexplicable wave of terror was seeping through the city, turning its peaceful hum into a low, threatening growl. News of the bizarre and frightening incidents soon reached Johnny Vanjuk in his makeshift home in the Staley Silk Mill. While the local radio stations played everything off as a series of unfortunate accidents, the late-night broadcasts from the pirate radio station told a different story. To the few who knew where to listen, it wasn't just a freak illness or a tragic accident, something darker was brewing beneath the surface. And Johnny, being a survivor, knew he had to prepare. The former silk mill was a fortress if one knew how to make it so. Johnny had always kept a low profile, spending his days collecting what he could use and hiding it away in the cavernous building. His stash ranged from old army ration packs to first aid supplies, blankets, and a small library of books he'd collected over the years. But now, it seemed, he had to focus on fortifying his abode. Meanwhile, the pastoral peace of Lancaster's farmland was being tainted as well. The seemingly unaffected areas, the haven of greenery, and the idyllic countryside were slowly falling prey to the inexplicable phenomenon. Even the stoic Amish community, with their disciplined lifestyle and limited contact with the outer world, weren't spared. No one understood what was happening, no one had the answers. The Lancaster General Hospital, usually a beacon of hope and recovery, was quickly becoming a house of horrors. Doctors were at their wits' end as more and more patients came in with the same symptoms: the fever, the paleness, the fatigue, and the hunger. The hunger that no amount of food seemed to quell. Nurses whispered about patients who had to be restrained, their strength oddly superhuman, their behavior animalistic. Fear started to live in the hospital corridors, lurking in the shadows, creeping in the silence. Amidst all this, Lancaster's schools became islands of faux normality. Despite the creeping terror, life had to go on, they said. But even there, the changes were creeping in. Absences started to spike. Teachers who once commanded classrooms with unwavering energy now stood pallid and shaky. Whispers among the students grew. It was no longer about weekend plans or schoolyard crushes, but rather hushed stories about what was happening in their quiet little city. At the center of it all, the once vibrant and life-filled Central Market turned into a specter of its former self. The once bustling stalls now stood half-empty. The air, which once held the enticing aroma of freshly baked goods, aromatic coffee, and ripe produce, was now tainted with an undercurrent of unease. The lively chatter was replaced by hushed voices, and the clinking mugs at the cafe corners echoed ominously. Meanwhile, the local government was struggling to maintain a semblance of control. Mayor Soros was under immense pressure, with state authorities pushing her to declare a state of emergency. Still, she was reluctant, hoping, praying that the situation would resolve itself, afraid of inciting panic. And so, as the sun set on Lancaster County, casting long, eerie shadows across the city, farms, and suburbs, people retreated into their homes, holding their loved ones close. Yet, each sunset brought about an increasing sense of dread, a dread of the unseen, the unknown, the unexplainable. Little did they know that their peaceful existence was on the brink of a terrifying transformation, the likes of which they could never have imagined. Little did they know that their sleep would soon be haunted by nightmares that refused to end come dawn. As the days wore on, Lancaster City, once alive with the constant ebb and flow of urban life, took on an eerie silence. The streets that once bustled with shoppers and students, workers, and wanderers were deserted. The cobblestone paths, usually warm from the constant tread of tires and footsteps, felt cold and lifeless. An unspoken curfew had fallen upon the city. Those who ventured out did so with a sense of urgency, a palpable fear etched on their faces. Doors were locked and bolted, windows were shuttered, and quiet prayers whispered. The city of Lancaster, which had always taken pride in its friendly neighborhoods and open homes, had now closed itself off, each house an island of anxiety and uncertainty. Across the city, in the imposing structure of the Staley Silk Mill, Johnny Vanjik was oblivious to the fear gripping Lancaster. His days were spent reinforcing the mill's already robust structure, boarding up windows and securing doors. His nights were filled with the crackling voices of the pirate radio, offering grim tales and ominous warnings. He knew, he understood, that a storm was coming, and he was preparing for it in the only way he knew how, surviving. Out in the farmlands, life had taken a turn for the surreal. The once serene expanse of fields and pastures now carried an unsettling air of dread. Farmers who usually woke up with the sun, tilling the earth and tending to their animals, were now scarcely seen outside their homes. Farmhouses that once stood as symbols of pastoral tranquility were now fortresses against an unseen enemy. Even the insular Amish communities were feeling the effects of the mysterious affliction that was steadily consuming the county. Their simple, predictable lives had been thrown into chaos. Age-old traditions were set aside, and the once thriving Sunday markets were now a shadow of their former selves. Yet, in their secluded world, the horror of Lancaster City felt far away, like a nightmare in the waking hours of the day. In the sprawling complex of Lancaster General Hospital, the situation was becoming increasingly desperate. What was once a place of healing and hope had now become a battlefield. Every day brought with it a new wave of afflicted individuals, their symptoms growing more severe with each passing hour. Doctors and nurses, their faces etched with fatigue and fear, fought tirelessly against an enemy they couldn't understand. Back in the city, the once thriving schools now echoed with emptiness. Desks were vacant, hallways quiet. The youthful energy that once resonated within the walls had been replaced by a foreboding silence. Yet, the local authorities insisted on keeping them open, a futile attempt to maintain a sense of normalcy. The strain on Mayor Soros was visible. Every press conference, every public appearance, her face seemed to carry the weight of the world. The city was looking to her for answers, for hope, but what could she offer when she herself was in the dark? As night fell over the county, the once comforting cloak of darkness now felt oppressive, heavy with the weight of the unknown. The city of Lancaster, the picturesque suburbs, and the pastoral farmlands were united in their fear, each heartbeat a countdown to the unimaginable horror that was slowly unfurling its grip on their world. Yet, among the growing despair, there was an undercurrent of resilience. The people of Lancaster, from the city to the farmlands, were fighters. They weren't going to let fear overrun their lives. Every locked door, every boarded window, every hushed prayer was a testament to their will to endure, to fight, and to survive. The storm was coming, but they were ready to weather it. Little did they know, the storm was unlike any they had ever faced, and it was only just beginning. In the desolate quiet that had settled over Lancaster City, the nighttime wanderings of a homeless man seemed insignificant. But Johnny Vanjik was far from insignificant, and his nocturnal journeys were far from aimless. There was a purpose in his stride, an urgency in his actions, an intensity in his eyes. While the city slept, clinging to a semblance of peace, Johnny took to the streets, preparing for the imminent tempest he felt in his bones. His destination was far from the comforting confines of the old Staley silk mill. The outskirts of Lancaster City, where the urban landscape gave way to the rugged outskirts, was a treasure trove of abandoned warehouses and forgotten factories. A haven for the homeless and those living on the fringes of society, it was also a goldmine for scavengers like Johnny. If he was to survive, he needed more than just food and water. He needed protection. And he knew just where to find it. As the moon cast long, looming shadows over the city, Johnny made his way through the darkened streets, his footsteps echoing against the cobblestones. The closer he got to the city's edge, the quieter it became. The once familiar cityscape, the towering buildings, the narrow alleyways, and the sprawling parks, all felt alien in the moonlight, morphing into uncharted territory. In the maze of deserted buildings, there was one that Johnny was particularly interested in, a dilapidated warehouse that once housed Lancaster's largest hunting and outdoor goods store. A place which, during its glory days, was a bustling hub for hunters, campers, and outdoorsmen. But now, it stood silent, its wide open spaces filled with the echoes of a forgotten era. With a makeshift crowbar, Johnny pried open the rusted doors, the grating sound shattering the stillness of the night. Inside, amid the dust and cobwebs, lay a myriad of hunting equipment, camping gear, and a collection of rusty but still usable tools. But Johnny was not interested in these. He knew what he was after. In the dimly lit corners of the warehouse, he found it, the gun section. It was a sight to behold, even in its state of disuse. Firearms of all types lined the walls, their deadly beauty now shrouded in a thick layer of dust. Johnny carefully made his way through, his practiced eyes scanning the dimly lit racks for something that could offer protection. As he moved deeper into the section, something caught his eye. It wasn't what he had in mind, but there was a sense of familiarity about it, a strange sense of déjà vu. A revolver lay tucked away behind a stack of old ammunition boxes. It was a .44 Magnum, its metallic surface still gleaming under the layers of dust. The weapon had an intimidating beauty, a lethal elegance, its cold, hard surface promising both protection and power. With a sense of reverence, Johnny picked up the revolver, its weight comforting in his hands. He found a cache of bullets nearby, hidden away as if waiting for the right hands to discover them. Johnny Vanjik, the lone survivor, the homeless scavenger, now held in his hands a weapon that had found him just as much as he had found it. Returning to the silk mill, the .44 Magnum tucked away safely, Johnny couldn't shake off a feeling of strange familiarity. The revolver, the feel of it in his hand, the way it balanced perfectly, it all felt right, like a missing puzzle piece clicking into place. Johnny didn't know why, but he felt a sense of comfort, a sense of readiness. As if the .44 Magnum was a promise of survival, a symbol of the fight he was ready to wage. Back in his fortress, under the protective shadows of the silk mill, Johnny Vanjuk, armed with a weapon he didn't know he was destined to find, braced himself for the unknown terrors yet to come. Outside, the city of Lancaster lay in fearful anticipation, its heartbeat echoing with an unspoken dread. The storm was no longer a distant rumble, it was upon them. And Johnny was ready. A week had passed since Johnny Vanjuk had found the .44 Magnum. Lancaster City, on the surface, had retained its relative calm. The days moved with a hushed pace, the nights fell with a silent sigh. The city still functioned, but it was a facsimile of its former self, an actor on a stage playing a role it no longer understood. Amidst the city, Ruby Street lay abandoned, a chilling testament to the creeping horror. Once a charming row of brick and stone townhouses, nestled in the heart of Lancaster City, it was now a ghostly reminder of the strange affliction. Every house was an echoing void, the lives that once filled them long since faded. The homes stood vacant, their doors and windows barred by the authorities, marked with yellow caution tape that fluttered in the cool summer breeze. The street, usually abuzz with the laughter of children and the banter of neighbors, was silent, save for the occasional whispering wind. Ruby Street, in the span of a week, had turned into a void in the heart of Lancaster City. Beneath the surface of normalcy, rumors continued to circulate. People spoke in hushed whispers, casting anxious glances towards Ruby Street. The gruesome events at the Brenneman household had claimed the entire street in its unfathomable horror, leaving an indelible mark on the city's consciousness. Mayor Soros, under increasing pressure, continued to assure the city that everything was under control. Yet, beneath her determined demeanor, there was a sense of growing unease. Ruby Street was not just a street anymore. It was a symbol of something inexplicable, something terrifying that had taken root in Lancaster City. Schools continued to function, albeit with dwindling attendance. Lancaster General Hospital was still at the forefront, its dedicated staff working tirelessly to understand the bizarre symptoms presented by the increasing number of patients. The local police patrolled the streets, their presence a meager comfort against the shadow of uncertainty. Life in Lancaster City was continuing, but it was a life held captive by a growing fear. Meanwhile, in the sturdy confines of the Staley silk mill, Johnny Vanjuk prepared. The .44 Magnum lay cleaned and loaded, its gleaming surface a strange comfort in the midst of the encroaching chaos. The city might have been functioning, but Johnny knew better. He could feel it in his bones, the impending storm. As Lancaster City moved into another week of fearful anticipation, the memory of Ruby Street loomed over its residents. An echo of laughter, a whisper of conversation, the shared look between neighbors, all overshadowed by the chilling silence that had claimed the once vibrant street. Despite the growing dread, there was a flicker of hope. The people of Lancaster City were fighters. They carried on, their resolve firm, their spirit unbroken. The memory of Ruby Street was a haunting reminder of the threat they faced, but it was also a symbol of their determination to not let fear consume their lives. Outside, the summer sun shone down on Lancaster City, its warm rays doing little to chase away the chilling uncertainty. But within each home, within each heart, a small flame of resilience burned bright. The city was holding its breath, bracing itself against the unknown. The storm was growing, but Lancaster City was not going to be swept away without a fight. The night draped itself over Lancaster City, a velvet canopy threaded with stars, the moon casting an ethereal glow over the cityscape. The deserted streets, the silent buildings, the hushed parks, all lay in a surreal stillness under the celestial spectacle. In the city center, the populace was on edge. As darkness descended, the streets cleared out, the once lively city falling into an uneasy slumber. Huddled in their homes, the city folk watched the quiet night with fearful eyes, their hearts pounding with an unspoken dread. In the distant murmur of the wind, in the shifting shadows, they saw things. Strange figures moved on the periphery of their vision, unseen in the dark but felt in the tremor of their nerves. The ethereal glow of the streetlights did nothing to ease their fear, their silhouettes casting long, monstrous shadows that danced on the cobblestone streets. The rumors spread like wildfire, whispers carried on the wind. They were seen, in the quiet corners of the city, in the unseen spaces where the city lights couldn't reach. Yet, no one could say what they were. It was a ghost story told in hushed tones, a chilling tale shared over hurried meals, an unspoken fear whispered into the darkness. Across town, in the stronghold of the Staley Silk Mill, Johnny Vanjik sat on the rooftop, his eyes scanning the cityscape. The .44 Magnum lay next to him, a cold, metallic sentinel against the unknown horrors of the night. Below him, the once bustling streets lay abandoned under the moonlight, a ghost town shrouded in mystery and fear. As he watched, an uncanny spectacle unfolded under the harsh glow of the streetlights. Figures, their forms obscured in the darkness, began to emerge. They moved with an eerie grace, their shuffling footsteps echoing against the desolate buildings, their presence a chilling blot on the silent cityscape. The moonlight reflected off their forms, painting a grotesque tableau on the canvas of the city street. The figures were silent, their movements coordinated yet aimless, their purpose unknown yet terrifying. They moved beneath Johnny's watchful gaze, an unholy congregation under the celestial spectacle. For a moment, they lingered under the streetlights, a chilling vision that would be seared into Johnny's memory. Then, as silently as they had appeared, they began to disperse. They moved away from the streetlights, their forms receding into the darkness, leaving behind an eerie quiet. The city streets, once the lifeline of Lancaster City, now lay abandoned and desolate. The people had retreated to the safety of their homes, their lives disrupted by a fear they couldn't understand. But on that street, under the protective shadow of the Staley Silk Mill, Johnny Vanjik remained. He was the lone sentinel of the deserted cityscape, the only living presence in a world slipping into an unseen chaos. From his rooftop vantage point, Johnny watched the retreating figures, the moonlight casting an otherworldly glow on his hardened features. He knew, now more than ever, that the storm was upon them. He also knew, deep in his heart, that he was ready. Ready to face the horrors that the night hid in its shadows, ready to fight the unknown terror that was slowly gripping Lancaster City. As dawn approached, the eerie quiet gave way to the first hints of daylight. Yet, the city remained in the grip of an unspoken dread. The echoes of the night lingered, a chilling memory of the unseen terror that had walked its streets. The storm had arrived, and Lancaster City, with Johnny Vanjik at its helm, braced itself for the fight of its life. The next morning, the residents of Lancaster City woke up to an unfamiliar reality. The dawn had broken as usual, its soft light casting a comforting glow over the city. But beneath the warmth of the morning sun, a cold unease had taken root. The strange events of the previous night were fresh in the minds of the city folk, a chilling reminder of the terror that lurked in the darkness. Amid the whispers and rumors, a loudspeaker echoed through the city. The mayor's voice, strained but firm, filled the streets, reaching every corner of Lancaster City. It was an announcement that would change the course of daily life in the city. A citywide curfew was being implemented, effective immediately. For the safety of our citizens, due to the ongoing situation, a citywide curfew from 8 p.m. to 6 a.m. has been implemented until further notice. All residents are required to stay indoors during these hours. All businesses are to close at 7:30 p.m. We urge everyone to cooperate with law enforcement during this time. Mayor Sorest's voice was filled with a determination that was comforting and alarming at the same time. As the message echoed through the city, the reality of the situation sank in. Lancaster City, once a bustling hub of activity even during the night, was to be silenced by fear. Local law enforcement began patrolling the streets, their presence a constant reminder of the escalating crisis. The bustling cityscape, once full of life and activity, was now a picture of enforced tranquility. Schools shifted to online education, businesses cut back their hours, and the lively chatter that filled the streets during the day quickly died down as the evening approached. The city, adapting to its new normal, moved through the day with a quiet resilience. Children played in their yards under the watchful eyes of their parents, neighbors exchanged reassuring smiles from a distance, and life went on, albeit in a muted manner. As dusk descended, the streets emptied out quickly, the city folk retreating to the safety of their homes. The bustling city, once a beacon of life and activity, was now a ghost town under the darkening sky. The streetlights flickered on, their glow casting long shadows on the deserted streets, a lonely sentinel in a city held captive by fear. Across town, in the desolate expanse of the Staley silk mill, Johnny Vanjik watched the city fall into a fearful slumber. The .44 Magnum lay by his side, a constant companion in the fight yet to come. As the city retreated into its shell, Johnny stood guard, a lone warrior ready to face the horrors of the dark. As the city fell into a state of enforced tranquility, darkness wrapping itself around the quiet buildings, a different scene was unfolding on the edge of the city. In a quaint neighborhood lined with beautifully preserved colonial-style houses, the Smiths' home, a charming two-story brick house with blooming geraniums by the front porch, stood innocently against the darkened sky. The Smiths, like all other families in Lancaster City, had retreated indoors, complying with the curfew orders. The night was still, the moon casting a silver sheen over the city. The Smiths' house, with its cozy warm lights and laughter filtering through the windows, was a contrast to the eerie quiet outside. But as the night deepened, the laughter slowly faded, the lights flickered out, and the Smith family retired for the night, their home a solitary island of peace in the hushed cityscape. It was then that something changed. From the dense cluster of oak trees that bordered the Smiths' backyard, a rustling sound emerged, breaking the eerie silence of the night. Shadows flickered across the moonlit lawn, forming and dissolving into the darkness. The back door of the Smiths' home, a sturdy oak piece secured with a deadbolt, suddenly rattled. It was a quiet sound, almost lost in the night, but it persisted. There was a sense of urgency, a subtle force behind the noise. And then, it happened. The quiet night was pierced by a crash. The back door of the Smiths' house, once secured, was now unhinged, swinging on its broken frame. The peaceful home had been breached. But by what, or by whom, was a chilling mystery. The shadows continued to dance, the night wind whispering through the broken door. Back in Lancaster City, the news of the break-in spread. Whispers of fear wrapped around the city, winding through its quiet streets, seeping into its silent homes. What had once been an abstract fear was now a tangible threat. The city held its breath, fear creeping into every corner, the broken door of the Smiths' home a haunting reminder of the horror that lurked in the dark. Through all this, Johnny Vanjik watched from the rooftop of the Staley silk mill. He could see the distant flickering of police lights, the city pulsating with a quiet fear. He gripped the .44 Magnum tighter, his resolve steeling with each passing moment. The storm was upon them, and it was darker than anyone had ever imagined. The situation in Lancaster City had rapidly escalated, leaving the local law enforcement stretched thin. Mayor Soros, in consultation with the police chief, made the call to reach out to neighboring towns and cities for assistance. First, the call went to Mannheim Borough Police Department. Mannheim, a town rich with Germanic heritage and known for its warm community spirit, immediately pledged its support. Their officers, trained in both urban and rural policing, were a much-needed addition to the city's overwhelmed forces. Next on the list was East Lampeter Township Police Department. The rolling farmland and picturesque landscapes of East Lampeter concealed a force well prepared for unexpected crises. The officers, many of whom had dealt with complex cases in their jurisdiction, were ready to lend their skills to the beleaguered city. Following this, they reached out to Ephrata Police Department. Despite being a smaller force, the Ephrata PD was known for their resourcefulness and community policing. Their officers were quick to pack their gear and head towards Lancaster City, eager to assist their neighbors in their hour of need. West Lampeter Township was also contacted. Known for its historic villages and peaceful communities, West Lampeter's officers were no strangers to rising up in the face of adversity. They, too, agreed to aid in bolstering Lancaster's law enforcement. Lancaster City Police Department also sought help from the larger city of Reading. The Reading Police Department, well equipped and accustomed to a higher crime rate, was a formidable force. They were more than willing to stand shoulder to shoulder with their Lancaster counterparts, offering both manpower and resources. Calls were also placed to smaller jurisdictions, such as the Leeds Borough Police and the Millersville Borough Police. These towns, with their idyllic streets and friendly communities, housed small but dedicated forces that were ready to lend a hand. Finally, they sought assistance from the Pennsylvania State Police, a highly trained force known for its discipline and readiness. With their wealth of experience and resources, the state police provided a significant boost to the city's defenses. The response from the neighboring towns and cities was overwhelmingly positive, their commitment a testament to the spirit of unity and cooperation that bound these communities together. In a matter of hours, the reinforcements began to pour in, their vehicles streaming into the city under the dim glow of the streetlights. With this, the city's defenses were strengthened, a solid line of resistance against the growing threat. But despite the bolstered numbers and resources, the fear and uncertainty remained, the broken door of the Smiths' home serving as a chilling reminder of the invisible enemy they were facing. Amidst it all, the solitary figure of Johnny Vanjik loomed over the city from the rooftop of the Staley Silk Mill. The .44 Magnum gleamed under the moonlight, a silent vow of protection against the shadows that threatened to engulf Lancaster City. Over the next week, the atmosphere in Lancaster City grew heavier with each passing day. The incident at the Smiths' home hung over the city like a dark cloud, casting a grim shadow over the daily life of its residents. The curfew, once a novel inconvenience, had become a reminder of the unseen terror that lurked in the city's corners. The reinforcement from the neighboring towns and cities had initially bolstered the morale of the citizens, but it became clear that even the combined forces were not enough to stem the tide of inexplicable occurrences that began to plague Lancaster City. Residents reported strange noises in the night, subtle rustlings, and unidentified shadows that dissolved into the darkness as soon as a light shone on them. The city's once lively night scene was replaced by eerie silences punctuated by distant, unidentifiable sounds that chilled the blood. Pets went missing, their owners waking up to empty kennels and silent homes. Lancaster Central Market, once a bustling hub of local produce, saw dwindling footfall as farmers from the county started avoiding the city. It seemed as if an invisible force was slowly constricting the city, its grip tightening with each passing day. Cases similar to the Smiths incident started cropping up in different parts of the city. Homes were found broken into, their occupants missing or worse, discovered in states that baffled the medical authorities. People whispered about these incidents, not daring to voice their fears, their whispers echoing the same dread: something was very wrong. Local law enforcement, bolstered by the reinforcements, patrolled the streets, their flashlights cutting through the darkness, their faces etched with concern. Despite their best efforts, they were no closer to understanding the nature of the threat, or how to combat it. As more reports of break-ins and disappearances came in, the city seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the storm to break. Amidst the growing panic, Johnny Vanjik remained a silent sentinel. From the rooftop of the Staley Silk Mill, he watched as the city grappled with the escalating crisis. The .44 Magnum by his side felt heavier, its cold steel a stark reminder of the fight that lay ahead. The city was changing, the darkness creeping in. But one thing was clear: Johnny wouldn't let it fall without a fight. As the days passed and the peculiar incidents continued to multiply, the Lancaster City Police Department, reinforced by officers from neighboring areas, launched a comprehensive investigation. The law enforcement personnel worked around the clock, their efforts centered on understanding the strange occurrences that were turning their once peaceful city into an arena of fear. The first major lead came from the examination of the broken-in houses. Each of these sites held a disturbing similarity. The points of entry, usually the back doors, were forced open with an incredible amount of force, enough to splinter the heavy wooden frames. Inside, the homes exhibited signs of struggle, but there was a conspicuous absence of any usual indications of a break-in, no stolen valuables, no sense of anything tampered or searched. The victims, when they were found, presented a deeper mystery. The coroner's office, led by the experienced Dr. Naomi Turner, struggled with the cases. The victims displayed an array of unexplained physical trauma that defied any traditional understanding. Uncommonly pale complexions, desiccated tissues, and in some instances, partial consumption. Yet no toxins or unfamiliar pathogens were discovered on the initial screens. The cause of death was left undetermined. Simultaneously, police forces combed through the streets, parks, and back alleys of Lancaster City, hunting for clues. The K-9 units were particularly unsettled. Trained police dogs, usually unflappable, whined and shied away from certain areas, their animal instincts seemingly rattled by something the human officers couldn't detect. Eyewitness accounts, though scattered and inconsistent, added another layer of enigma to the investigation. People spoke of fleeting figures in the night, moving with an unnatural gait. Yet, when pursued, these figures seemed to evaporate into the shadows, leaving no traces behind. Despite tireless days and sleepless nights, the police could assemble no clear picture from the puzzle pieces they had gathered. They were dealing with an adversary that was unlike any they had encountered before. The lack of a clear pattern, motive, or even a consistent description of the suspects left the officers in uncharted waters. Daily briefings in the Lancaster City Police Department had become a cacophony of theories, each more unusual than the last. The investigative team was grappling with a phenomenon that defied all logic and protocol they had been trained to follow. From his perch atop the Staley Silk Mill, Johnny Vanjik watched the city wrestle with the growing enigma. The .44 Magnum, lying in close reach, was an unspoken promise of a battle to come. As Lancaster City delved deeper into the mystery, Johnny was already bracing himself, preparing for the looming confrontation with the faceless enemy. In response to the escalating crisis, the Lancaster City Police Department set up a dedicated task force, pooling resources and expertise from the different law enforcement agencies that had come to aid the city. The City Hall became a nerve center of activity, the hushed whispers of the city council members mixing with the constant hum of activity from the task force. Each day, officers fanned out across the city, conducting door-to-door inquiries, trying to piece together the fragments of information they could gather. They collected security camera footage from various parts of the city, hoping to catch a glimpse of the elusive figures that the residents had reported. But the footage was inconclusive at best. Most cameras had captured nothing more than indistinct shapes moving in the periphery of the frame. The few instances where the figures were more visible, they appeared distorted, their movements jerky and irregular, like a badly edited video. The city's medical facilities, already dealing with an unusual number of patients exhibiting unexplained symptoms, struggled to provide answers. Despite exhaustive testing, the physicians could not identify the cause behind the extreme fatigue, pallor, and in some cases, the almost trance-like state that some patients slipped into. The police, in their investigation, discovered certain areas in the city where these incidents seemed to concentrate. But these hot zones, as they came to be called, had little in common: a peaceful suburban neighborhood, a busy commercial block, the city park, all fell within these areas. The seemingly random nature of these zones only added to the growing frustration. Meanwhile, the city's animal control department reported an unusual increase in the number of strays found in the city. Cats, dogs, even birds seemed to be fleeing their homes, their once friendly demeanor replaced by a skittish fear. They, too, displayed the same pale complexions and signs of fatigue seen in the human victims, but no known illness matched the symptoms. With every passing day, the mystery seemed to deepen. The pieces of the puzzle that the police had gathered did not fit together, each new piece only making the picture more incomprehensible. The city, once a beacon of calm and order, was being consumed by an inexplicable phenomenon, its facade of peace slowly cracking under the pressure. Through it all, Johnny Vanjik watched. His gaze swept across the city from the vantage point atop the Staley Silk Mill, the .44 Magnum always within reach. Each day, each new piece of news, each unexplained incident, was a step towards the fight that he knew was coming. As the city braced itself against the unseen enemy, Johnny prepared himself for the fight that was brewing on the horizon. As the shadow of unease continued to darken over Lancaster City, an uncanny spectacle unfolded one night. Under the cloak of darkness, from the remote corners of the city, peculiar figures began to stir. These were the elusive figures that had so far haunted the city's periphery, their existence marked only by fleeting glimpses and blurred security footage. They moved with a strange, unnerving cadence, their silhouettes distorted by the faint city lights. The figures, individually barely noticeable, began to congregate. What started as scattered threads of darkness slowly weaved into an ominous tapestry that spanned across the city. With the city under curfew, the streets were deserted, save for the patrolling officers. However, this mass exodus of shadowy figures remained just out of sight, skirting the edges of the light thrown by the patrol cars, slinking through the labyrinth of the city's back alleys, and moving with a singular focus towards the outskirts. By the time this phalanx of oddities reached Millersville, their numbers had swelled to an alarming 100. The sleepy town, at the cusp of a new day, was completely unprepared for the horrors that descended upon it. The night in Millersville erupted into an orchestra of terror. Homes were breached, streets were flooded, and the normally peaceful night air was pierced by cries that abruptly fell silent. In a matter of hours, Millersville was plunged into an eerie quiet, its essence wiped out, leaving behind a chilling emptiness. When dawn broke over Lancaster County, the news of the nightmare in Millersville swept through the communities like a cold gust of winter wind. The nearby towns of Mannheim, East Lampeter, Ephrata, and West Lampeter, and even the city of Reading, were all shaken by the grim reality that had befallen their neighbor. In response to the unprecedented horror, the governor declared martial law throughout Lancaster County. The announcement echoed through the cities and towns, its grim tone a stark contrast to the normally tranquil Pennsylvania morning. Police and state troopers, now reinforced by the National Guard, barricaded the roads leading in and out of Lancaster County, their grim faces reflecting the gravity of the situation. Residents were ordered to stay indoors, their homes turned into fortresses against an enemy they could neither see nor understand. Checkpoints sprouted across the city like ominous mushrooms, the men and women manning them staring into the distance, their hands never straying far from their weapons. As the sun set over Lancaster County, the atmosphere was fraught with fear and uncertainty. The once vibrant communities were now under the grip of martial law, their streets patrolled by armed forces, their nights illuminated by the harsh lights of military vehicles. From his vantage point on the Staley Silk Mill, Johnny Vanjuk watched as the shadows of the city grew longer and deeper. His hand rested on the .44 Magnum, the cold steel a grim reminder of the looming battle. The horror that had descended on Millersville was moving, its next target unknown. But one thing was certain, Lancaster City was bracing for a fight it could not afford to lose. 4 weeks had passed since the first incident on Ruby Street. The atmosphere in Lancaster County was saturated with a dreadful anticipation that was as palpable as the approaching storm clouds on the horizon. Meanwhile, Johnny Vanjuk, Lancaster's lone sentinel, had been steeling himself for the inevitable confrontation. One evening, as Johnny sat atop the Staley Silk Mill, a sense of unease stirred within him. It was as if the whispering wind carried a warning. Casting a sweeping gaze over the city, he spotted the aberration, a cluster of stumbling figures, heading straight for his sanctuary. He didn't have much time. Clambering down from the roof, Johnny fortified his position at the entrance of the silk mill, the weight of the .44 Magnum reassuring in his hands. The ensuing minutes were a game of agonizing wait, the silence of the mill gnawing at his nerves. Then, they arrived. Their features were grotesquely distorted, their bodies in a state of unsettling decay. They moved with an unnerving unison, as if drawn by a singular, inhuman instinct. These weren't the elusive, shadowy figures of the past weeks. The state of decay and the predatory glint in their eyes revealed a horrifying truth: they had become something less than human. The ensuing encounter was swift and brutal. As they lunged at Johnny, he responded with the .44 Magnum, its booming retort echoing within the old mill. Each shot found its target, the force throwing the assailants backward, their lifeless bodies collapsing onto the mill floor. When the adrenaline ebbed away, and the echoes of the gunfire died down, Johnny approached one of the lifeless figures. A closer examination confirmed his suspicions. The decaying flesh, the vacant stare, the peculiar gait, all the signs pointed to a dreadful reality. They were not human, not anymore. They were the undead. With the mystery finally unmasked, Johnny prepared for the inevitable. The eerie phenomenon that had gripped Lancaster County was far more sinister than anyone had imagined. The once bustling city was now a ticking time bomb, with the undead as the silent countdown. The next day, Johnny surveyed the streets from his position atop the silk mill. The cityscape bore a stark contrast to the Lancaster city of a month ago. It was a city under siege, bracing for an impending storm. And Johnny Vanjuk, the city's lone sentinel, was ready to weather it. Once darkness had spread its cloak over Lancaster City, Johnny Vanjik began his grim task. He moved with a stealth that belied his rugged frame, the chilling task ahead lending him a grim determination. The bodies of the undead, now nothing more than grotesque monuments to a horrifying transformation, had to be moved. One by one, he loaded the bodies onto an old industrial trolley he had found in the depths of the Staley silk mill. He then covered the trolley with a thick canvas sheet, shrouding the evidence of the grim encounter from prying eyes. His destination was the Lancaster City Police Department, a few miles away from the mill. Johnny was careful to avoid the main roads, keeping to the labyrinth of alleyways that crisscrossed the city. He maneuvered the heavy trolley through the maze with an uncanny familiarity, making it to the police station undetected. There, under the cover of night, he deposited his grim cargo at the back door of the station. Before he left, he attached a note to the canvas sheet. It was a simple piece of worn-out cardboard on which he had scrawled, "From the Duke." And then, as silently as he had come, Johnny Vanjik disappeared back into the night. Morning found the Lancaster City Police Department aghast at the horrifying discovery at their doorstep. The sight of the decaying bodies sent ripples of unease through the officers. They cordoned off the area and set to work examining the bodies, each one revealing the same eerie tale of transformation. The victims were in varying stages of decay, their bodies twisted in ways that defied the laws of human anatomy. Their flesh was marred with lesions and decay, their eyes vacant and lifeless. The sight of the bodies sent a shiver down the spines of the most seasoned officers. This was unlike anything they had ever seen. The cryptic note from the Duke only added to the enigma. The police department delved into their records, searching for any known entities who might go by that name, but their search was in vain. Days turned into a whirlwind of forensic tests and consultations with medical experts, but the grim truth was undeniable. The city was dealing with a phenomenon beyond their understanding. These were not mere victims of an unknown illness, they were transformed beings, their humanity stripped away. As the truth sank in, a chilling realization spread through the department. The sinister events that had plagued the city, the disappearance of Millersville, the declaration of martial law, everything led back to these horrifying creatures. They were the undead. The city was under attack by a force that defied nature and understanding. And amidst this escalating chaos, the only clue to their existence came from an unknown entity, the Duke. The news hit Lancaster City like a bolt of lightning, the revelation casting a shadow of terror over the city. Martial law or not, the city was on edge, its people helpless in the face of the unknown. The police department, however, had a new focus. Amid the panic and confusion, they had a lead, a glimmer of hope in the form of a mysterious vigilante. The Duke had shown them the enemy, now, it was their turn to fight. Nightfall had once again enveloped Lancaster City, a chilling reminder of the menace that lurked in the darkness. Johnny Vanjik, or as he had introduced himself to the city, the Duke, was prepared. As night claimed the city, he set off on his nightly vigil, navigating the rooftops with an uncanny ease that seemed more fitting for a feral cat than a rugged man. The city's architecture lent itself to his nocturnal sojourns. Centuries-old buildings huddled together, their rooftops creating a silent, uninterrupted path that only Johnny knew how to tread. The chill of the night was cut by the steady rhythm of his heart, his senses honed in on the sounds that echoed through the empty streets below. He was midway through his patrol when he heard it, a faint rustling, followed by a chillingly familiar guttural groan. A chill ran down his spine. It was them, the undead. His eyes followed the sound, focusing on a small two-story townhouse nestled at the end of a quiet street. In its dimly lit front yard, a cluster of decaying figures was gathered, their focus unerringly set on the townhouse. Johnny didn't hesitate. With a swift movement, he descended from the rooftops, his descent masked by the shadows of the night. By the time he reached the front yard, the undead had begun their dreadful assault on the house's front door. Beyond the door, Johnny could hear the frightened whispers of a family, their voices trembling with fear. He was their only hope. Moving swiftly, he unsheathed the .44 Magnum, its cold steel glinting under the moonlight. One by one, he picked off the undead assailants, each shot a chilling echo in the silent night. The figures dropped to the ground, their final groans a dreadful testament to their inhuman existence. It was over as quickly as it had begun. Johnny stood in the yard, his heart pounding in his chest. The door to the townhouse creaked open, revealing a terrified family peering out into the night. Their eyes widened in shock at the sight of the fallen undead, then shifted to the shadowy figure standing in their yard. Without a word, Johnny holstered his weapon and retreated back into the shadows. He left behind a terrified family, their home now a fortress against an enemy they could neither see nor understand. But they were safe, for now. For in the darkness, a guardian moved silently, his watchful eyes scanning the city, his heart steeled against the horrors that lurked within. The Duke had made his move, a silent pledge to protect the city he called home. As dawn broke over Lancaster City, the echoes of the prior night's encounter still rang in the ears of the bewildered family. They had survived an attack by the undead, a reality that was as terrifying as it was inexplicable. However, their survival wasn't merely a stroke of luck, it was the result of an intervention by a shadowy figure, an unseen protector. The father, a stout man named Martin, was the first to break the stunned silence. He picked up the phone and dialed the police, his hands shaking as he recounted the horrifying events of the previous night. Officers from the Lancaster City Police Department were quick to arrive. As they cordoned off the area, the family watched from the safety of their home, their eyes wide with fear and disbelief. The evidence lay sprawled on their front yard, decaying bodies, each with a fatal gunshot wound. Martin narrated the events of the previous night. There was someone, a man. He saved us, he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. I don't know who he was there, and then he wasn't. The officers exchanged uneasy glances. This was the second time they had come across the bodies of the undead, and once again, a vigilante seemed to be involved. The cryptic message from the Duke had been a puzzle, and this new development only deepened the mystery. Within the hour, the news of the incident spread through the city like wildfire. The local media outlets picked up the story, their sensational headlines adding fuel to the growing fear and confusion. Mysterious protector saves family from undead, one headline blared. Who is the Duke? Questioned another. Through it all, Lancaster City Police Department found themselves at the heart of a mystery that was as perplexing as it was terrifying. The undead were not just an anomaly, they were a threat to the city and its people. And amidst this rising tide of fear, a vigilante had emerged, a beacon of hope in the darkest of times. The city was teetering on the edge of chaos, its people living in constant fear of the unknown. And yet, there was a sense of hope. If the mysterious Duke could hold back the tide, maybe they could survive this. Lancaster City was in the grip of a nightmare, but it wasn't standing alone. It had a guardian, a protector in the shadows. The city held its breath, waiting for the next move of the Duke. The news of the undead had cast a shadow of terror over Lancaster City, but life, as it often does, had found a way to trudge on. The city was on edge, its once bustling streets now quiet and apprehensive. The enforced curfew and the constant presence of the National Guard added to the eerie silence that blanketed the city. The uneasy peace, however, was short-lived. It was a Tuesday, a day that would be seared into the memory of Lancaster City forever. It started as an ordinary day, the morning sunlight filtering through the silent streets, casting long shadows that seemed to hint at the horror that was about to unfold. It began on King Street, one of the city's main arteries. A group of the undead, larger than any that had been seen before, shambled onto the street. Their vacant eyes and grotesque appearance sent a wave of panic through the area, the terrified cries of the citizens echoing through the street. Within minutes, the local law enforcement and the National Guard were on the scene, their vehicles forming a barricade at the end of King Street. What had started as a quiet day had suddenly morphed into a standoff between the city's protectors and the undead. The air was thick with tension as the law enforcement officers and National Guard soldiers took up positions, their weapons trained on the slowly advancing group of the undead. It was a horrific sight, a chilling testament to the city's worst fears come to life. And then, all hell broke loose. The standoff ended as the undead charged, their ghastly groans filling the air. The response was swift and deadly. Gunfire echoed through King Street, each shot landing with deadly accuracy. The undead fell, one by one, their bodies collapsing onto the pavement. Despite their effort, the defenders found themselves overwhelmed. The undead were relentless, their number seemingly unending. The barricade held, but barely. Every fallen undead seemed to be replaced by two more, their grotesque forms an unending wave of horror. The battle raged on, the gunfire and screams echoing through the city. Slowly, the tide began to turn. The defenders, bolstered by reinforcements, started to regain control. One by one, the undead fell, until finally, King Street fell silent once again. The cost, however, was high. Many brave officers and soldiers had lost their lives, their sacrifice a grim reminder of the threat the city faced. The barricade on King Street stood victorious, but scarred, a haunting testament to the city's darkest day. News of the battle spread through Lancaster City like wildfire. The horror of the undead was no longer a shadow lurking in the corners, it had made itself known in broad daylight. But amidst the fear and despair, there was a spark of hope. They had fought back, held their ground. They had survived. But the question lingered in the air, for how long? In the aftermath of the horrific incident on King Street, the Lancaster City Police Department and the National Guard launched an extensive investigation. The bodies of the undead were collected and transported to an isolated facility on the outskirts of the city. There, a team of forensic experts and biologists worked tirelessly to unravel the mysteries of these gruesome creatures. As the days turned into weeks, a clearer picture of the undead began to emerge. Contrary to the mindless, feral zombies portrayed in movies and television, these creatures exhibited behavior that was eerily organized and purposeful. They were more like pack animals, coordinating their movements and actions in a chilling display of collective consciousness. Dr. Laura Williams, a leading behavioral ecologist brought in to assist with the investigation, shared her insights with the team. Their group dynamics are similar to wolves or other pack animals, she explained, her eyes reflecting a strange mix of fascination and dread. They seem to have leaders and followers, and they act in unison, much like a coordinated hunting group. The revelation sent a shiver of unease through the team. The undead were not mindless monsters, they were organized and strategic, their collective behavior adding a terrifying new dimension to their threat. This newfound knowledge was disseminated to all law enforcement and military personnel involved in the city's defense. Tactics were re-evaluated and adjusted, with a focus on disrupting the pack dynamics of the undead. Despite the unease, there was a glimmer of hope. The more they understood their enemy, the better their chances of survival. News of these findings also reached the citizens of Lancaster City. Although the information sparked fear, it also ignited a sense of unity and resilience. The enemy was formidable, but not invincible. The city was under siege, but it was not defeated. Amidst the growing horror, Lancaster City held its ground, its people united by a common enemy and a shared determination to survive. Unbeknownst to them, a solitary figure moved among the rooftops, watching over the city. The Duke, Lancaster City's silent protector, observed the changing dynamics. His mind was a whirl of thoughts, his strategies adapting to the evolving enemy. He was the city's shadow, its silent guardian, and he was ready for the battle to come. After the mass casualty in Millersville, the neighboring town was transformed into a large quarantine zone. Now, the once quaint town known for its friendly community and charming downtown bore an unrecognizable appearance, with barricades, warning signs, and military vehicles lining the streets. No one was allowed in or out without proper clearance. Millersville had become ground zero for understanding the mysterious undead phenomenon. Day and night, scientific teams ventured into the secured area, wearing hazmat suits and armed with a variety of tools and equipment. These brave men and women were the front line in a battle not fought with bullets and barricades, but with research and data. Led by Dr. Laura Williams and a team of renowned experts from across the country, the scientists operated from a makeshift laboratory set up in the heart of the town. They worked tirelessly, studying every detail of the undead invasion, from analyzing the behaviors of the undead to scrutinizing the molecular details of the virus that seemed to have sparked this horror. They examined the environment, the homes that had been broken into, the paths the undead had traveled. They collected samples, swabbing door handles, sidewalks, and the very air for traces of the virus. Their work was meticulous, exhaustive, and unending. Every piece of data, every observation was a potential key to understanding, and ultimately combating, the undead plague. In a way, Millersville had become a grim symbol of hope for Lancaster County. Every revelation, every tiny breakthrough brought them a step closer to understanding the enemy they were up against. The tireless work of the scientists was a beacon of hope amidst the despair. Even as the town lay in ruin, it offered the best chance for a way to turn the tide. From the outskirts of the quarantine zone, the silent figure of the Duke observed. His eyes roamed over the bustling activity of the scientists, his mind absorbing the information, always learning, always preparing. This was a war, and knowledge was his weapon. And he intended to use it to protect his city at all costs. One chilly night, while the city was lost in an uneasy sleep, a group of young kids, defiant in their youth, broke the curfew and ventured out into the abandoned city streets. The city that was once filled with lights, laughter, and life now felt like an eerie ghost town, every alleyway and corner a potential hiding spot for the undead. Unbeknownst to the kids, they were being watched from above. Johnny Vanjuk, the silent protector of Lancaster City, kept a vigilant eye on them from the rooftops. He had come to know the patterns and timings of the undead, and he knew they were not alone in the streets that night. As the kids ventured deeper into the city, a small group of the undead became aware of their presence. Like a wave, the undead began to converge on the location of the unsuspecting youngsters. Johnny, spotting the movement from his vantage point, quickly realized the danger. His heart pounded as he sprinted across the rooftops, his every instinct focused on getting to the kids before the undead. Just as the undead closed in, Johnny dropped from the rooftops, his .44 Magnum roaring in the quiet night. The undead fell, their grotesque bodies collapsing onto the cold pavement. The kids, terrified, huddled together as Johnny fought off their attackers. In the heat of the moment, one of the undead lunged at Johnny, its rotten teeth sinking into his arm. A sharp pain shot through him, but he quickly pushed the creature away and ended its unholy existence with a swift pull of the trigger. After ensuring the threat was neutralized, he herded the shaken kids, instructing them to hurry home and not to speak of this night. The kids, their youthful defiance replaced with fear, nodded and hurriedly scampered off into the night. Alone now, Johnny examined the bite on his arm. It was deep, the decayed teeth of the undead having sunk into his flesh. He cleaned the wound as best as he could, wrapping it tightly. As he moved back to his rooftop refuge, a sense of dread filled him. The bite was an unknown variable, a potential death sentence. Days turned into weeks, and Johnny found himself waiting for the change, for the virus to take hold. But the anticipated transformation never came. Despite the bite, he remained himself, the wound on his arm slowly healing. He felt no hunger for human flesh, no loss of self. It was a mystery, a puzzle that added another layer to the already complicated situation. But for now, Johnny had more immediate concerns. The city needed him, the innocent lives at stake were his responsibility. The silent guardian of Lancaster City was wounded but undeterred. He would continue to watch over his city, his resolve stronger than ever. The mystery of his immunity was something to be solved another day. As days passed into weeks, Johnny found himself adapting to his nocturnal lifestyle. The city was quieter at night, the threats more predictable. And while the world slept, he was the unblinking eye, always watching. But over time, he began to notice a strange change within himself. Johnny had always been keenly aware of his surroundings, his senses honed by a life lived on the edge. But recently, his night vision had grown significantly sharper. At first, he attributed it to his constant maneuvering in the dark, but it went beyond that. It was as if darkness held no secrets from him anymore. One night, while perched on a rooftop overlooking Prince Street, he found himself observing the faint outlines of buildings, the rustling of leaves in the trees, the distant figures moving in the shadows. Everything was unusually clear, as if the darkness had lifted, leaving a world of grays and muted colors. As he moved from rooftop to rooftop, he felt a strange familiarity. It was as if he was tracing a path that he had walked before, but not in this world, not in this life. It was a sensation of déjà vu, but it felt stronger, deeper. Like a whisper from a different story, a story that wasn't his, but felt oddly connected to him. Perhaps it was the memory of a dream, or a trick of his mind playing with him amidst the chaos. But every night as he patrolled the city, the feeling persisted. It was as if he was not just Johnny Vanjuk, the homeless guardian of Lancaster City, but someone else, someone from another place, another time. Someone who, like him, roamed the wastelands in a world of fallout. This new ability, this uncanny night vision, felt like a gift, a tool he could use to protect his city better. The eerie familiarity, the echoes of another existence, they remained a mystery. But for Johnny, they became a part of his nightly patrols, a secret he carried as he watched over Lancaster City, ever vigilant, ever watchful. Whatever the source, this newfound power had its advantages. As he looked down on the city from his rooftop perch, his eyes piercing the darkness, he felt ready. Ready to face the undead, ready to protect his city. The mystery of his other self would have to wait. For now, he was the Duke, the guardian of Lancaster City, and he had a city to protect. One late evening, as the sun set and shadows began to consume the city, Johnny found himself perched atop his favored refuge, an old brick building that offered a vantage point to survey the entire cityscape. The darkened windows of the once bustling Lancaster City reflected the last vestiges of the setting sun, painting a picture of eeriness and abandonment. He could sense the city falling into its habitual silence, an uneasy quiet that had become the norm ever since the outbreak. Streetlights flickered, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to come alive with each passing moment. For most, darkness was a shroud of fear, a time when the unknown could lurk around any corner. But for Johnny, it had become his ally, his cloak of invisibility. As twilight gave way to the black of night, Johnny began his patrol. He moved stealthily across the rooftops, his form barely a silhouette against the inky backdrop of the sky. His senses were alert, every noise amplified in the quiet night. The rustling of leaves in the distance, the far-off hooting of an owl, the occasional creak of a loose shutter in the wind, he registered them all. But there was something else, something new, an enhancement to his vision that had grown progressively stronger in recent weeks. The darkened city below, which should have been a blanket of obscurity, was astonishingly clear to him. He could see the outlines of the city's buildings, the distinct shapes of the abandoned vehicles on the streets, and even the distant figures moving in the shadows, their features clear and discernible. It was uncanny, a transformation he couldn't explain. In the depths of darkness, his eyes found light, revealing a grayscale world that seemed surreal. It was as if his eyes had developed their own night vision, enabling him to see in the darkness, like an animal adapted to the nocturnal hunt. As he moved across the city, the eerie familiarity of his path stirred a strange sense of déjà vu in him. It was as though he was following a path that was imprinted in his mind from another life, a different existence. A sense of destiny seemed to course through him, strange and unfathomable. It was as if an echo from a different story, a story not his, but intrinsically connected to him, resonated in his existence. The sensation was cryptic, almost mystical, as if he was touching the fringes of a reality that was not his own. A reality where he was not just Johnny Vanjuk, the homeless man turned guardian of Lancaster City, but another entity altogether. Someone else who had walked the deserted landscapes in a world shadowed by a different kind of apocalypse, a fallout. Someone, who like him, fought to survive, fought to protect. Yet, the mystery didn't distract him from his duty. If anything, it empowered him. This newfound ability was a tool, an asset in his mission. He embraced it, just like the mysterious whisper from another world. For now, the enigma of his strange connection with another reality was a puzzle to be solved another day. He was the Duke, the protector of Lancaster City, his eyes piercing the darkness, ready and prepared to face whatever threats the night would bring. Life in Lancaster City had evolved into a constant state of alert, the once vibrant streets now echoing with an eerie silence, broken only by the occasional outbreaks that had become a dreadfully common occurrence. People no longer took walks in the park or strolled down streets lined with historic red brick buildings. The city's usual hustle and bustle had given way to an underlying current of fear, the quiet punctuated by occasional chaos. One particular evening, the silence was disrupted by an unsettling chorus of screams echoing from several points across the city. At a row of quaint townhouses on West Walnut Street, the residents had locked themselves in their homes after spotting a group of the infected moving slowly but surely down the street. Over on South Prince Street, a man's cry for help echoed through the darkness as he was cornered by another such group in an alley. Simultaneously, towards the outskirts of the city, in the suburban neighborhood of Mannheim Township, families were frantically calling emergency lines as their tranquil community was invaded by yet another horde of infected, lured by the scent of living beings. The police force, stretched thin as it was, along with the National Guard, scrambled to respond. Lancaster's civil defense system blared, an ominous symphony of sirens resonating throughout the city. The echoing wails served as both a warning and a beacon of hope for the residents, an auditory reminder that they were not yet forgotten. In the midst of this escalating chaos, Johnny was a solitary figure racing across the rooftops, the eerie glow of his eyes piercing through the darkness. He had felt the wave of fear that gripped the city, a ripple of dread that manifested itself in the screams and pleas echoing in the night. His heart pounded in his chest as he leaped from one rooftop to another, his form barely visible against the dark sky. 3 different areas, 3 different outbreaks. The magnitude of the situation was not lost on him. This was the most activity he had seen since the first days of the virus emergence. It seemed as though the infected were adapting, organizing, turning from solitary predators into coordinated packs. Johnny made his way towards the townhouses on West Walnut Street first. He could see the horde moving relentlessly, a grotesque mockery of the living. He steeled himself, his fingers closing around the cool metal of his .44 Magnum. Tonight was going to be a long night. His city was under siege, and he was one of its last lines of defense. Johnny moved like a specter through the cityscape, descending swiftly from his vantage point onto West Walnut Street. The grim tableau that greeted him was a chilling sight, the horde of infected, a staggering mass of bodies writhing and squirming with a hunger that was all too familiar. His grip tightened around the handle of his Magnum, the cold metal seeming to burn in his clenched fist. As he moved closer, his night vision allowed him to pick out the individual faces of the infected in horrific detail. Their eyes held an empty, hollow gaze, skin stretched taut over cheekbones, and mouths opened in a grotesque parody of a snarl. Each figure bore the unmistakable signs of the virus that had ravaged them, transforming them into the abominations before him. He took a deep breath, steadying his nerves, and stepped into the circle of dim street light. The horde turned as one, their disconcerting focus now on him. In the deadly silence that ensued, he could hear the slow grind of his boot on the gravel, the drumming of his heartbeat the only music to this macabre dance. Then, with a swift movement, he raised his weapon and opened fire. The .44 Magnum boomed in the quiet night, its report echoing off the city's abandoned buildings. Johnny moved fluidly, firing, reloading, then firing again, each shot finding its mark. The horde stumbled and fell, piece by piece, under the onslaught of his attack. Their numbers dwindled, but they pressed on, driven by their insatiable hunger. Across the city, the Lancaster City Police Department and the National Guard were engaged in a similar standoff on South Prince Street. It was a tense and chaotic scene, gunshots echoed in the narrow alleyways, bouncing off the red brick facades as the men fought against the onslaught of the infected. Despite the grim odds, they held their ground, a wall of determination against the nightmare before them. In Mannheim Township, the suburban tranquility was shattered by the horrifying invasion of yet another horde. Residents watched in terrified awe from their barricaded homes as a new force emerged from the darkness to meet the threat. These were not police, nor the National Guard. These were men and women, clad in dark clothing and moving with lethal purpose. Their identities remained hidden, their presence an enigma. Like a dance, they moved with swift precision and brutal efficiency. Blades flashed in the dim streetlight, glinting ominously as they cut through the air and into the infected. Firepower supplemented their attack, the distinct sound of crossbows twanging, sending bolts flying with deadly accuracy. It was a choreographed ballet of destruction, painting a macabre scene in the once peaceful suburban neighborhood. Back on West Walnut Street, Johnny's fight was reaching a crescendo. His breath came in ragged gasps, the adrenaline and exertion taking a toll. His hand was a blur as he dispatched the last of the infected. As the final figure crumbled to the ground, silence descended on the street again. He stood alone, the lone survivor amidst a field of destruction, the deafening echoes of the battle slowly fading into the night. Across the city, the hum of the civil defense siren waned, leaving a disturbing quietude in its wake. The night was once again reclaimed by the ominous darkness, the events of the past hour a chilling testament to the new reality of Lancaster City. The threat had been abated, for now, a small victory in an otherwise losing battle. The fight was far from over, and Johnny knew it. But as long as he drew breath, he would stand guard, a silent sentinel in the night. As Johnny continued his lonely battle on West Walnut Street, a sudden flurry of activity drew his attention to the entrance of the street. Emerging from the darkness, a group of figures rapidly advanced towards the remaining infected. It was the mysterious human hunters from Mannheim Township. They moved as if they were one entity, a phantom of the night that had brought swift justice to the infected in Mannheim and now turned its attention towards Lancaster City. They came into view, their faces shrouded in the shadows of their hoods, a chilling, lethal specter born out of necessity in these troubling times. The leader, a formidable figure in a dark, weather-worn coat, unsheathed a sword that gleamed ominously under the moonlight. Without a moment's hesitation, the hunters charged into the fray, their deadly dance of destruction once again taking shape. Crossbow bolts zipped through the air, their trajectory unfaltering as they found their targets in the infected horde. In tandem with Johnny's relentless assault, the hunters cut through the horde with brutal efficiency. Their presence turned the tide of the battle, their concerted efforts whittling down the number of infected faster than Johnny could have managed alone. It was a sight to behold, the force of human resilience and determination against the monstrosities that once were their own. As the last of the infected fell to the ground, the street fell into an eerie silence once again, the echoes of the battle fading into the cold night. The hunters didn't linger, their purpose fulfilled. With a final glance towards Johnny, the figure in the worn coat gave a curt nod before leading his group away, disappearing as swiftly as they had arrived. The solitary vigilante was left standing alone amidst the carnage, a silent sentinel bathed in the dim glow of the street lights. In the aftermath of the battle, a sense of grim satisfaction washed over him. They had won the night, but the war was far from over. As long as the infected roamed Lancaster County, Johnny Vanjik would continue his watch, ready to defend his city with every fiber of his being. As the first rays of dawn began to seep into the sky, bathing Lancaster City in a soft, orange glow, Johnny made his way back to his haven amidst the urban jungle, the derelict Staley Silk Mill on Martha Avenue. This colossal red brick structure, standing like a silent sentinel over the old industrial heart of the city, had long since ceased to echo with the hum of looms and the chatter of workers. Now, it provided a secluded sanctuary for Johnny, a place to rest and plan for the nights to come. On this morning, however, he was not alone. As he clambered through the broken entrance of the mill, he felt a presence behind him. He turned, his hand instinctively going to the handle of his magnum. A lone figure emerged from the shadows, her hands raised in a non-threatening gesture. She was one of the hunters from the night before. Her eyes were a glowing white, an otherworldly gleam that seemed to cut through the semi-darkness of the mill. Johnny tensed but did not draw his weapon. He could feel it, a resonance of sorts, as if he was staring into a distorted reflection of himself. After a moment of mutual silence, the hunter began to speak. Her voice was low, hushed, yet carried an undeniable force with it. She introduced herself as Selene. They spoke for hours, their conversation flowing like a meandering river. The discussion varied from their individual experiences with the outbreak, their encounters with the infected, to their unique night vision. Their discourse eventually led them to a mutual realization. The virus that had infected them, and presumably others, did not merely turn humans into mindless monsters. For those with an innate resistance, it induced a state of evolution, augmenting their physical abilities, gifting them the power to see in the dark, and seemingly slowing their aging process. However, this evolution was not without its curses. The constant hunger, the lingering fear of losing oneself to the infection, the loneliness of existing on the fringe of humanity, these were the crosses they had to bear. As Selene rose to leave, she paused at the entrance of the mill. The sun was now higher in the sky, bathing the derelict structure in a warm glow. She turned to Johnny, her luminous eyes reflecting the light. "We are not alone, Johnny. There are others like us, fighting to survive, fighting to protect. This evolution, as you call it, it has chosen us. We are the first of a new kind. Remember, you're not alone in this fight." With those parting words, Selene disappeared into the bright morning, leaving Johnny alone in the echoing vastness of the old silk mill. His mind churned with the revelations of their conversation. This was bigger than him, bigger than Lancaster City. And in that moment, Johnny Vanjik realized he was part of a new chapter in human evolution, a beacon of hope in a world teetering on the brink of annihilation. As the sun faded beyond the horizon, bathing Lancaster in the familiar shroud of darkness, Johnny found himself on the rooftop of a dilapidated row house, overlooking the city. His enhanced vision traced the labyrinth of streets, scanning for any signs of the infected. The city seemed quiet, the inhabitants obeying the imposed curfew. Suddenly, a soft whistle sliced through the air, a carefully structured sequence. Johnny turned towards the sound, his eyes quickly focusing on a group of shadowy figures standing atop the opposing rooftop. One of them stepped forward, their silhouette distinct against the dim glow of the moon. "Duke!" the figure called out. His voice was strong and gruff, echoing over the sea of silent rooftops. "We heard of you." Johnny's fingers tightened around the handle of his magnum, his stance wary but not aggressive. The figure lowered his hood, revealing a weathered face etched with countless battles and glowing eyes, much like his own. "We've been tracking the movements of the infected, much like yourself," the figure began. Johnny recognized him as one of the hunters he had observed during the earlier encounters. They introduced themselves as the Night Watch, a group of survivors who, like Johnny and Selene, had been touched by the virus, yet were far from turning into one of the mindless undead. The man who had addressed Johnny was their leader, Jonas. As the conversation unfolded, they discussed their similar experiences, the disturbing developments in Lancaster and the surrounding towns, and the evolving behavior of the infected. Jonas expressed his respect for Johnny's solitary vigil over Lancaster City, the tales of the Duke protecting the streets, a vigilante legend that had grown amongst the surviving communities. Throughout the conversation, Johnny could see the group's dedication and resolve, their conviction that they could turn the tide, that they could protect the people they cared about. He could see his own struggles reflected in their stories, his own fears echoed in their worries. The discussions lasted for hours, flowing from strategic planning to sharing insights on dealing with the infected. The group expressed a genuine interest in collaborating, in standing together against the growing hordes. Jonas ended the conversation with a simple offer. "You're not alone in this, Duke. We're fighting the same fight. Lancaster needs us, more than ever. What do you say?" The night was quieter as the echoes of their conversation faded. Johnny was left on the rooftop, gazing at the city below, his mind abuzz with the possibilities. With the break of dawn, a new era for Lancaster could begin, a unified front against the shadows that lurked within. The Night Watch and the Duke, standing together for Lancaster. As darkness thickened over Lancaster City, enveloping its buildings and streets in an ominous shroud, Johnny Vanjik and the Night Watch stationed themselves on rooftops surrounding the Lancaster police station. The once bustling heart of law enforcement in the city was now a fortress under siege. Shadows moved restlessly around its perimeter, the infected drawn to it like moths to a flame. Johnny's luminous eyes scanned the encroaching horde with clinical precision, the .44 Magnum feeling like an extension of his arm. Beside him, Jonas signaled to the rest of the Night Watch, his silhouetted figure tense against the moonlit sky. As if on cue, the first wave of infected lunged towards the barricaded station, their unearthly growls shattering the night's eerie silence. Johnny's hand tightened around his magnum. The echoes of Jonas' words were still fresh in his mind. "You're not alone in this, Duke. We're fighting the same fight. Lancaster needs us, more than ever." With the precision of a seasoned sniper, Johnny took aim and fired. The first of the infected fell, his bullet shattering its skull. Around him, the Night Watch sprang into action, their weapons dispatching the undead with brutal efficiency. Each shot was a symphony of survival, a testament to their shared purpose. Despite their efforts, the undead pressed on, their numbers overwhelming. But the group of hunters did not relent, their shots becoming more rapid, their movements more synchronized. The sharp crack of their guns echoed through the night, blending with the guttural cries of the infected. Johnny, fueled by adrenaline, darted from rooftop to rooftop, his gun never ceasing its deadly chorus. He could see the lights flickering in the police station, hear the muffled shots from within. He knew they were holding on, spurred by the hope that dawn would bring. The battle seemed to stretch into an eternity, time diluting into a whirl of gunfire and desperate cries. But slowly, the tide began to turn. The once relentless wave of infected began to thin, their advance slowing. Johnny and the Night Watch kept their onslaught, determination etched in every shot, every movement. As the first glimmers of dawn began to permeate the night, the final shot rang out. The courtyard of the police station, once teeming with the undead, was now littered with their remains. Exhaustion seeping into his bones, Johnny lowered his magnum, his eyes meeting those of Jonas across the battlefield. There was a mutual understanding, a shared victory. The night had been brutal, but they had held their ground. They had defended the symbol of order, the beacon of hope in Lancaster City. This was their fight, and together, they had won the night. The Lancaster police station had survived the siege, standing tall in the face of despair, a testament to their unified front against the darkness. In the grey light of dawn, as Lancaster City began to stir from its enforced curfew, Johnny and the Night Watch found themselves perched on the rooftop of the Hager building, their gaze fixed on the digital screen outside the Lancaster police station. The station was a bustle of activity, reporters from local stations scrambling for the best spots as city officials prepared to address the city. The events of the previous night had echoed through the city, whispers of the Duke and the Night Watch intertwined with stories of the police station's survival. "Good morning, Lancaster," Police Chief Harris began, his face etched with the weariness of the night but his eyes bright with resolve. "We stand here today after a long and terrifying night. A night where we faced an unimaginable horror and, yet, we survived." He paused, glancing down at his notes before looking straight into the camera. "Our survival was not just a result of our training or our preparations. We owe a great debt to some brave citizens of Lancaster, who stood beside us, fought with us, and saved this station from falling into the hands of the infected." Chief Harris continued, detailing the events of the night, the relentless onslaught of the infected and the tireless defense put up by the Night Watch and the Duke. He didn't glamorize the events or exaggerate the stakes, he laid it out just as it was, a desperate struggle for survival. "We don't know much about them," Chief Harris said, referring to the Night Watch and the Duke. "But what we do know is that they are on our side. They are fighting to protect this city, just like us. And for that, we owe them our gratitude." The press conference continued, with Chief Harris assuring the citizens of Lancaster that they were doing everything in their power to safeguard the city, to study and understand this evolving threat. But it was the recognition of their efforts, the acknowledgement of their shared battle, that resonated with Johnny and the Night Watch. As they watched from the rooftop, bathed in the morning light, they shared a moment of quiet understanding. Their efforts, their sacrifices, were not going unnoticed. They were making a difference, one night at a time. Over the course of a month, Lancaster City became a city transformed. Its streets, once bustling with daily activity, now held a somber stillness during the day, and an eerie quietude at night. The curfew was strictly enforced, the buildings bore the scars of numerous skirmishes, and the police station stood tall like a sentinel, a beacon of steadfast resilience. Yet, outside the confines of Lancaster County, life was remarkably normal. The nation watched with bated breath as news from the cordoned-off Lancaster City trickled into the public sphere, but the virus, or what many were now starting to call the evolutionary virus, had been successfully contained. In nearby Philadelphia, children still played in parks, joggers still took their daily routes by the Schuylkill River, and the iconic Liberty Bell remained a beacon of American resilience. There were precautionary measures, of course, enhanced health screenings, increased funding for infectious disease research, emergency plans in place, but life went on with a semblance of normalcy. Further afield in the steel city of Pittsburgh, the hustle and bustle of the Strip District markets continued as vendors haggled over prices, the aroma of grilled kielbasa and fresh pierogies filling the air. The University of Pittsburgh was a hive of scientific activity, with teams working around the clock to understand the virus, their research fueled by samples flown in from Lancaster. Across the country, the Golden Gate Bridge still spanned the bay, basking in the California sun, while Hollywood continued to churn out its blockbusters, although apocalyptic themes had certainly gained a surge in popularity. To the east, the vibrant metropolis of New York City continued its relentless pace, albeit with a wary eye on the events unfolding in Lancaster. And so it was, from the serene shores of the Pacific Northwest to the bustling streets of Miami, life continued in the wake of Lancaster's struggle. The nation watched, hoped, and learned from Lancaster City's resilience, believing in their collective strength to confront the unprecedented situation. In the meantime, Lancaster City stood as a fortress, a testament to the indomitable spirit of its people, walled off but not defeated, fighting a battle on behalf of all mankind. And at the forefront of this battle, standing tall on the rooftops against the haunting silhouette of the night, were Johnny the Duke Vanjik and the Night Watch, the unseen guardians of Lancaster City. As the days rolled into weeks and weeks into months, the residents of Lancaster County became intimately acquainted with their altered reality. The line that separated day and night, previously blurred by the conveniences of modern living, had now hardened into a stark demarcation of safety and danger. The infected had demonstrated a peculiar aversion to daylight, slinking away to the forests surrounding the county and disappearing into the labyrinthine network of sewers and underground tunnels. Teams of military personnel and scientists were dispatched daily to these areas, their mission to understand and contain this strange behavior. Meanwhile, Lancaster County found itself isolated from the rest of Pennsylvania. A strict quarantine was enforced by the National Guard, their armored vehicles and barricades a constant reminder of the city's isolation. Inbound traffic was a thing of the past, and the only vehicles allowed entry were the armored military convoys that arrived weekly carrying provisions, medical supplies, and new personnel. The air was punctuated regularly by the drone of C-130 Hercules aircraft dropping air cargo, bundles of food, medical supplies, and other essential goods parachuted down to distribution centers around the city. Everyday life in the county had shifted dramatically. Schools had closed their doors, and in its place, a form of distance learning was instituted with lessons broadcasted over the radio and internet. Children adapted to classrooms without friends, their schoolyard chatter replaced by the measured tones of their radio teachers. The absence of laughter and the hum of learning was felt deeply within the community. The fertile farmland that characterized Lancaster County became an even more precious resource. The famous Central Market adapted, becoming a distribution center for locally grown produce and livestock. Farmers worked in tandem with military personnel, their tractors often escorted by armored Humvees as they moved from field to market. Local hospitals were transformed into fortresses, their walls fortified and guarded by military personnel. Doctors, nurses, and other healthcare professionals, once ordinary citizens, were now frontline soldiers in a battle against an invisible enemy. Their efforts were tireless, their dedication unwavering. Working life too had evolved. Small businesses that could operate remotely did so, while others adapted to provide essential services in this new world. Mechanics now serviced military vehicles alongside civilian cars. Restaurants that once served Amish pot pie or chicken corn soup now prepared meals for distribution centers. Despite the trials, life in Lancaster County continued. Through determination, adaptation, and sheer grit, the citizens of Lancaster had forged a new existence in the face of adversity. In this altered world, the line between night and day had taken on a new meaning, a rhythm of survival, a testament to human resilience. It was a dance with the unknown, a constant adaptation to a threat that lurked in the shadows, a symphony of survival orchestrated by an entire community, led by the nocturnal vigil of their unsung heroes, Johnny the Duke Vanjik and the Night Watch. The sun had just begun its descent, the sky over Lancaster County painted with the vibrant hues of dusk. The day's work had been wrapped up earlier than usual, the normally bustling streets now desolate, an eerie silence taking hold as the clock ticked closer to 7:30 p.m. With the sky transitioning from gold to the purples and blues of twilight, a new noise began to drown out the last chirping birds. An unsettling symphony of groans and roars echoed from the distant tree line. It was an hour earlier than they usually appeared, and it felt like an ominous prelude to a dissonant harmony that the county had grown to dread. Rural families had hastily barricaded themselves into their homes. Farmers abandoned their tractors mid-field, dashing towards the perceived safety of their homes. The streets of towns like Elizabethtown, Leeds, and Ephrata were emptied as the residents scrambled indoors. Their fear was palpable. The onset of the early night's activity was unsettling. On the borders of Lancaster County, the local police and the National Guard, accompanied by armored military vehicles, were setting up defenses. They had received word from the interior of the advancing threat. Barricades were erected, rifles loaded, and the men steeled themselves for the confrontation. Yet, as the noises grew louder and the forest line began to rustle with an unnerving intensity, a sense of trepidation filled the air. As darkness fell, they emerged from the tree-line, an ocean of snarling, undead creatures advancing towards the border defenses. The officers and soldiers opened fire, the rat-tat-tat of automatic gunfire echoing in the still night. But there were too many. They surged forward relentlessly, seemingly undeterred by the bullets ripping through their decaying bodies. Backup was called, but it would take time for additional forces to arrive. The defenders were steadily pushed back, each foot yielded to the undead felt like a mile. The line was on the verge of breaking. A sickening sense of dread took hold. Were the defenses to fail, the creatures would spill into the neighboring counties, and Lancaster's nightmare would become Pennsylvania's terror. Yet, just when things seemed bleakest, a gunshot echoed above the din. The defenders turned, their eyes drawn towards the source, the silhouette of a man standing tall on a ridge overlooking the battleground. The moonlight glinted off the barrel of his .44 Magnum, the figure of Johnny the Duke Vanjik unmistakable. Almost simultaneously, from the opposite side, a team of individuals advanced, their night vision goggles glowing ominously in the darkness. The Night Watch had joined the fray. With their arrival, hope flickered among the defenders. The Duke, atop his ridge, opened fire, each pull of his revolver's trigger finding its mark, while the Night Watch moved like wraiths through the undead, their movements precise and deadly. The balance began to shift. But the night was young, and the battle was far from over. The Duke was like a specter in the moonlight, his .44 Magnum barking in the cool night air as he dispatched one undead creature after another. Yet for every creature he fell, it seemed as if two more took its place. The sea of undead was relentless, their insatiable hunger driving them onward despite the hail of bullets. The Night Watch fought with equal ferocity. They wove through the horde like ghosts, their blades slicing through decayed flesh, their guns echoing in a grim chorus with the Duke's. But even their combined might struggled to stem the tide of the advancing horde. The situation was dire, but at that moment, the purr of engines echoed through the night, growing louder with each passing moment. Reinforcements were here. Squad cars from neighboring police departments from York, Reading, Hershey, and more flooded into the area, their lights piercing the darkness. They were followed closely by a column of National Guard Humvees, their gunners adding their firepower to the fray. The added reinforcements bolstered the line, slowing the advance of the undead. The battle raged on for what felt like an eternity, the night punctuated with the eerie growls of the undead, the crack of firearms, and the occasional shout or yell from the human defenders. The horde seemed endless, their onslaught a nightmare that showed no signs of stopping. Just as the defenders felt their spirits wane, the first rays of the morning sun began to peek over the horizon. The undead creatures recoiled, their growls turning into pitiful whimpers as they began to retreat from the dawning light. But it was clear to all involved, from the beleaguered police officers and soldiers to the weary Duke and Night Watch, that this was merely a reprieve. The sun would set again, and the undead would return in force. The battle was far from over, the long night had only just begun. As the last of the retreating undead disappeared into the morning fog, a tense quiet fell upon the border checkpoint. The officers, soldiers, and vigilante defenders were united in a collective moment of exhaustion and relief. Still, the sense of victory was tempered by the chilling realization that they were all living on borrowed time. In the wake of the chaotic battle, the authorities attempted to restore order and to gain a sense of control over the inexplicable situation. Both the Duke and Night Watch were an enigma, a variable in this increasingly complex and terrifying equation that they needed to understand. The Duke was approached by Captain Lisa Martinez of the Lancaster Police Department, a determined woman who had risen through the ranks with sheer tenacity and a keen instinct. She had a reputation for being a no-nonsense cop, someone who sought out the truth no matter how hard it was to swallow. In her eyes, the Duke saw a reflection of his own determination, a spark of fearlessness that had kept Lancaster standing amidst the chaos. "Appreciate the help, Duke," she began, her tone all business. "We need to talk." Meanwhile, a group of National Guard officers approached Night Watch. The leader, Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Dalton, was a seasoned officer. He was experienced enough to recognize the expertise and discipline exhibited by Night Watch in the heat of battle. It was not a ragtag group of vigilantes, they were organized, systematic, almost military in their approach. "We owe you our gratitude," Dalton started, looking at each member of the Night Watch, "but I believe we'd all benefit from understanding each other better." In the light of the early morning, as the first hints of normalcy returned to the border checkpoint, a lengthy dialogue began between the reluctant heroes and the authorities. There were moments of tension, misunderstandings, and reluctant revelations, but it was a necessary conversation for the days to come. How these entities, forged in the crucible of an apocalypse, would learn to work together was uncertain. The Duke and the Night Watch were enigmas, a conundrum that the authorities had to unravel. The paths they had walked were shrouded in shadows and mystery, a reflection of the dark times that had descended upon Lancaster. But as the morning wore on and the sun climbed higher into the sky, there was a feeling of solidarity building, an alliance being formed. They were all soldiers in the same war, each fighting to keep the spark of humanity alive in the face of the unknown. Their stories were still being written, their roles in this new world still being defined. One thing was clear: they needed each other to survive, to thrive, to reclaim Lancaster from the clutches of the undead. This long, detailed discussion formed a tentative bridge between the vigilante groups and the authorities. It laid the foundation for a united front, a coalition of the willing in a world unwilling to yield to normalcy. Only time would tell how this alliance would fare when the sun set again, and the undead rose from the shadows. As the discussions continued, the Duke and the members of the Night Watch grew quiet. A shared glance between them communicated an unspoken agreement. It was time to reveal what set them apart from the rest. Slowly, one by one, they lifted their sunglasses, revealing eyes that glowed with an unnatural, radiant green hue. Gasps echoed throughout the crowd of law enforcement officers and soldiers. Captain Martinez and Lieutenant Colonel Dalton watched, eyes wide in surprise and a flicker of fear. But they remained silent, allowing the vigilante groups to continue. "These eyes," the Duke started, his voice firm, "they're not a result of some supernatural force or mutation. It's evolution." He rolled up his sleeve, revealing a healed bite mark on his forearm. The flesh around it was tinged with a subtle green hue, much like his eyes. Members of Night Watch followed his lead, revealing similar bite marks on their bodies. "We were bitten, just like the people who turned into what you've been fighting against. But our bodies fought back, adapted, evolved," the leader of Night Watch, a man known only as Orion, added. "It seems like the virus, or whatever this is, forces rapid evolutionary traits onto those it infects. Most, turn into those creatures. Some of us, however, are different. We get these," he pointed at his glowing eyes, "night vision, enhanced strength, speed. But we retain our humanity." A stunned silence followed Orion's explanation. The revelation that the virus was not just a mindless disease, but a forced evolutionary catalyst, sent shockwaves through the assembled crowd. Many were unable to comprehend the implications, their minds reeling at the enormity of it all. The vigilantes' revelation changed the paradigm. It was no longer just about survival, it was also about understanding this new stage of human evolution and finding a way to control it. It was clear that the battle against the undead was far from over, but with this newfound knowledge, there was a glimmer of hope. The rest of the day was spent in further discussions, plans, and strategies. The alliance between the Duke, Night Watch, and the authorities solidified, their roles now clearly defined. They were the defenders of humanity, the guardians of evolution, standing together against the shadowy menace that threatened their world. In the days that followed, Lancaster County began to change. Schools started teaching survival skills alongside regular academics. Hospitals expanded their research to understand the virus and its effects better. Farms and other food resources were fortified. Life had altered irrevocably, but the will of the people remained unbroken. In the face of forced evolution, they chose to evolve, to adapt, and to fight back. The vigilante groups stood as living proof of humanity's resilience, the embodiment of hope in a world shrouded in darkness. The battle had just begun, but they were ready. The sun would rise again over Lancaster. As the revelation sank in, a convoy of vehicles pulled up on the scene. Scientists and doctors from the CDC, clad in biohazard suits and armed with all kinds of medical and scientific equipment, exited the vehicles and made their way towards the group. The Duke and the Night Watch agreed to be examined. It was an opportunity to learn more about this new facet of the human condition, perhaps even discover a way to control the virus's effects and find a cure. Sitting on the makeshift examination tables that were set up under a large tent, they were poked and prodded with all manner of tools. Blood was drawn, swabs were taken, and every inch of their bodies, especially the healed bite marks, were studied in detail. Their eyes were of particular interest. Doctors shone lights into them, observing the way their pupils contracted and dilated. The glow of their irises under the intense scrutiny was mesmerizing, ethereal. "What's the sensation like?" "The night vision." One of the doctors, a woman named Dr. Simmons, asked the Duke. "Everything is sharper, clearer," he responded, his voice distant as he remembered the first time he saw in the dark. "It's like looking at the world in high definition, and it's all bathed in this greenish glow. There's no blindness, no struggling to see." Simultaneously, in another corner of the tent, Orion was discussing their increased physical capabilities with another scientist. "We're stronger, faster," he was saying, flexing his hand for emphasis. "Our reflexes are heightened too. It's not superhuman, but definitely more than a normal human being." Every bit of information was meticulously recorded, every test conducted with precision. There was a sense of urgency, but also the undercurrent of excitement. This was an unprecedented event, something no one ever thought they'd witness in their lifetime. Hours passed. The sky was beginning to lighten when the examinations were finally concluded. Tired but determined, the medical and scientific teams packed their equipment and headed back to their mobile labs to start analyzing the collected data. The Duke and Night Watch, despite the exhaustive procedures, seemed to be in good spirits. For the first time in months, they saw a glimmer of hope, a chance to turn the tide. Their evolution might hold the key to the survival of Lancaster, maybe even the world. Only time would tell. The dawn's early light fell upon a grim scene. Bodies of the undead, felled by the intense struggle of the previous night, were now being lined up for examination. The effort was not just a matter of containment or cleanup but was aimed at gaining a deeper understanding of this horrid transformation process. Each body was treated with a clinical detachment that was nothing short of extraordinary. Scientists from the CDC donned their biohazard suits and started their grim task. They photographed, measured, took samples, and documented every feature of the deceased. They were particularly interested in the mouth and teeth, where the transmission of the virus presumably took place. As the examinations proceeded, some curious observations began to emerge. The scientists found that some of these bodies were not just recently deceased. A muffled exclamation of surprise came from Dr. Simmons, as she knelt beside one body. She held in her gloved hand a tarnished military dog tag, encrusted with the grime of ages. The text on it was barely legible but seemed to indicate a service date from World War II. The body, although with the expected decomposition from the undead state, also showed signs of very long-term decay. Simultaneously, another scientist found a musket ball embedded in an undead's rib cage, a wound that had long since healed over, hinting at a life lived and lost during the American Revolution. In another chilling discovery, an undead's clothes were identified as a uniform of a nurse from World War I. Time had worn it thin, but the distinct insignia and the vintage design were unmistakable. The realization sank in heavily, this was not merely an infection of the present. Somehow, these bodies from eras long past had reanimated, joining the ranks of the undead. It suggested that the virus was not only infecting the living but was also capable of awakening the long deceased, making it far more terrifying and complex than previously believed. The once silent dawn was now filled with murmured speculations and the steady clicking of scientific equipment. The sight of centuries-old undead only intensified the resolve of the scientists to understand and combat this terrifying evolutionary virus. And somewhere, in the echoing silence of the deserted city streets, the Duke and Night Watch stood watch, guardians against the mounting darkness. After several days of grueling analysis, the test results from the blood samples of the Duke and the members of the Night Watch were finally ready. The data was both intriguing and baffling. It was discovered that the gene responsible for the changes was present in all humans, dormant in their DNA. The scientists explained it as a sort of biological time bomb, a quirk of evolution that had lain dormant for eons, only to manifest now. The undead, it seemed, were not the product of some new, foreign virus, but a terrifying expression of human evolution that had waited patiently in our genes. The bite marks of the undead merely served as a catalyst, accelerating the process of transformation. While some individuals' bodies were able to resist the transformation into undead monstrosities, they were not immune to the changes entirely. The Duke and the Night Watch members were the living proof. Their bodies had fought off the more horrific aspects of the transformation. Instead, they had adapted, gaining abilities such as enhanced night vision, making them uniquely equipped to combat the undead. However, it was noted that this resistance was not universal. Others bitten were not so lucky, their bodies unable to resist the transformation, becoming one of the undead. The implications of these findings were far-reaching. It wasn't just about surviving an outbreak anymore. It was about understanding this new stage of human evolution, a stage that had been set in motion by the ticking of a biological clock that had started counting down from the very moment of our inception as a species. The fight against the undead had taken a turn, no longer just a battle for survival, but a quest for understanding. The dawn of a new era had arrived, one that demanded adaptation and evolution of its own kind. It was a struggle, not just against the undead, but also against the very nature of what it meant to be human. The revelation was a harsh blow to everyone present. There was no cure for this, no antibiotic or vaccine that could treat what wasn't a disease but a transformation. The world wasn't dealing with a mere virus outbreak, it was facing an unprecedented change in human biology itself, an alteration of our genetic heritage that couldn't simply be reversed. Scientists and medical professionals alike started working tirelessly on the task at hand. The focus shifted from looking for a cure to finding a way to manipulate the process of the transformation. Their objective was clear: find a way to suppress the horrifying traits of the evolution and enhance the beneficial ones, such as the improved night vision and heightened physical capabilities. Their efforts were monumental, but they were racing against time. The effects of this evolutionary shift were already in motion, and the experts estimated that it would take years to fully understand and manipulate this process. Time they feared, they did not have. Yet, the gravity of the situation did not deter them. If anything, it galvanized their determination to unlock the secrets of this sudden evolution, to ensure the survival of the human race. The undead were no longer the only threat, they were competing against the very genetic code that defined them as a species. Meanwhile, the world outside Lancaster County had been closely watching the unfolding events. Despite the strict quarantine measures in place, there was a growing concern that similar phenomena could start happening elsewhere. The gene was not exclusive to Lancaster, it was present in all humans. It was a chilling reminder of their fragile mortality and the unpredictability of evolution. The transformation, it seemed, did not discriminate. It could happen anywhere, to anyone. The countdown had started, and the world waited with bated breath, unsure of what the future would bring. The world outside Lancaster County started to tighten its grip. The uncertainty bred fear, which swiftly transformed into a global state of vigilance. Countries started to draft plans for potential outbreaks, keeping a watchful eye on any signs of change. The human race could not afford to be caught off guard again. Within Lancaster, life had taken on a strange dichotomy. On one hand, it was the epicenter of an unprecedented event. It was a place of terror and wonder, of science pushing its boundaries, and humanity fighting against the tide. On the other hand, it was just a county trying to survive, with people working in the fields, children studying in makeshift classrooms, doctors working in hospitals, and soldiers standing guard. Life, it seemed, was adamant on going on. Farmers continued to sow seeds, ensuring that the county had enough food. Despite the risks, convoys made their way in and out of Lancaster, the armored vehicles making their regular trips with military precision. Skyward, helicopters flew over the county, dropping essential supplies to those who were in dire need. The city was starting to resemble a fortress. Buildings were fortified and streets were meticulously monitored. A curfew was still in place, with the populace strictly adhering to it. During the day, there was a sense of wary normality. But as the sun set, the city transformed. The streets were emptied and the silence was broken only by the occasional growl in the distance or the footsteps of the vigilant guards. The line between day and night had never been clearer. The once frightful darkness now harbored their defenders. The Duke and the Night Watch had become symbols of resistance and survival. The glowing green eyes were not feared but respected. They were the vanguard, standing between the undead and the city. Every night, they ventured into the darkness, their enhanced vision a beacon in the gloom. Their days were spent resting, preparing, and sometimes aiding scientists in their relentless pursuit of knowledge about the new human condition. Despite the challenges, there was a sense of unity and resilience among the people. They understood that they were not just survivors, but the first responders in the face of a possible global shift. They were the front line, and they were ready to fight. Whether in the farmlands or the research labs, the classrooms, or the rooftops, everyone was contributing, trying to keep the flame of humanity alive. As the world held its breath and watched, Lancaster County stood its ground, a bulwark in the face of uncertainty and change, showing what humanity could do when pushed against the wall. They were a beacon of hope in the darkness, a testament to human spirit and resilience. Night had fallen upon Lancaster County, and under the cover of darkness, an organized group of individuals were moving with a shared purpose. They were setting up a base in what was once the Lancaster City Police Parking Garage, a location known for its strategic importance and accessibility. These individuals were the collective known as the Night Watch, and the man who had quickly become their de facto leader, Johnny, otherwise known as the Duke. The parking garage had seen better days, its concrete walls still bore the scars of past encounters, but it was a defensible location, and it was central. This place was to become the heart of their operation. Throughout the night, members of Night Watch moved equipment into the garage, converting it into a place that could support them in their mission. The garage's spacious, open area was perfect for training sessions, while the numerous parked vehicles provided perfect cover for practical drills. Small offices within the facility were converted into meeting rooms and strategy centers. Makeshift beds were set up for those who needed to rest before another night of battle. But what made this place truly special was the sense of camaraderie that filled the air. It was no longer a simple garage, it was the hunter's haven. Across the city, another transformation was underway. The old Staley Silk Mill, a derelict, had for some time served as Johnny's home. Its large open space and structurally sound building made it an ideal place to convert into a makeshift hospital. Under the expert guidance of the local doctors and with the help of volunteers, the loom mill started its transformation. Old rusting machinery was cleared out, making way for beds and medical equipment. The basement was turned into a storage area for supplies and medicine, and the old administrative offices became doctors' quarters and examination rooms. With a dedicated team of medical professionals, the hospital started receiving patients. Despite the circumstances, the people worked tirelessly, caring for the injured and conducting research on the undead affliction. The sounds of looms and weaving machines had been replaced by soft whispers of comfort and the constant fight against death. The sight of the old mill shining brightly in the darkness, with silhouettes moving behind the brightly lit windows, became a beacon of hope for many. Despite the fear and uncertainty, the people of Lancaster took comfort knowing their city was not only defending itself but also taking care of its own. With these changes, Lancaster was adapting, evolving just as its citizens had. Amid the grim reality of their situation, the city was not only surviving, it was standing strong, fighting back, ready for the challenges that were yet to come. These buildings, these people, were a testament to human spirit, endurance, and the will to survive. They served as a reminder, in these dark times, that light could be found even in the unlikeliest of places. As dusk bled into night, an eerie silence fell over Lancaster. The usually vibrant cityscape, now a somber labyrinth of empty streets and closed shops, had an air of foreboding. Even as life tried to prevail, the lights in the houses seemed to flicker apprehensively, mirroring the tension palpable in the air. Then, it began. At first, it was a distant echo, a low, guttural growl barely perceptible against the soft rustling of leaves. Slowly, the distant echo transformed into a terrifying symphony of moans and roars. The dread-filled silence of the city was abruptly shattered by the cacophony of the oncoming undead. From the depths of the darkness, they emerged, a teeming mass of shadows under the faint glow of the city's remaining streetlights. The undead were here, in numbers greater than ever before. In response, a call to arms echoed across the city. Sirens blared, loud and clear, and a resonating hum of activity filled the air as Lancaster's defenders sprung into action. The Night Watch, the Duke, and the remaining city police force, joined by civilian volunteers, readied themselves for the battle of their lives. Across the city, barricades were quickly erected, trapping the undead within the confines of certain streets. From rooftops and windows, defenders started to rain down a volley of bullets and makeshift explosives on the advancing horde. The sharp retort of gunfire echoed in the night, accompanied by the occasional burst of flame as a Molotov cocktail found its mark. At the heart of the defense was the Lancaster City Police Garage, now the Hunter's Base. The Duke and the Night Watch had positioned themselves strategically around the city, using the knowledge of their home ground to their advantage. Despite the chaos, there was a sense of unity, a shared determination that ran like a lifeline through the entire city. However, the sheer number of undead made it clear this wasn't a typical night. This was an orchestrated attack, a mass gathering of the undead unlike anything the city had faced before. The battle had just begun, the city of Lancaster fighting for its survival against an unimaginable enemy. No matter the outcome, Lancaster City would be forever changed. This night would either see the city fall into the hands of the undead or stand victorious against the gathering darkness. But for now, the city fought, its defenders standing their ground bravely under the menacing shadow of the undead horde. The battle was far from over. As the battle wore on, fatigue began to creep into the defenders. The tide of undead seemed unending, each one felt replaced by another, and the pressure started to show. Ammunition was running low, and the fear that they might be overwhelmed started to take root. Just when the situation appeared dire, the distant rumble of engines permeated the night. A moment of confusion gave way to hope as the rumble grew louder, resonating through the city streets, overpowering even the guttural growls of the undead. The defenders looked towards the city's outskirts, their hopes pinned on the burgeoning noise. Suddenly, out of the darkness, a column of armored vehicles broke into the city limits. The leading line of M1 Abrams tanks, behemoths of the battlefield, roared onto the scene, their hulls gleaming ominously under the glow of the streetlights. With their arrival, the momentum of the battle shifted. The thunderous roar of the tanks' cannons echoed throughout the city as they unleashed their wrath on the undead hordes. High explosive rounds met their targets with devastating precision, tearing through the undead, causing them to scatter. The tanks plowed through the ranks of the undead, their powerful tracks grinding the threat under their mighty weight. On the ground, the embattled defenders took heart from the reinforcements. The arrival of the Abrams instilled new vigor in the police, Night Watch, and the Duke. With renewed energy, they fought on, pushing back against the seemingly relentless tide of undead. Alongside the tanks, armored personnel carriers unloaded squads of soldiers into the city streets. The reinforcements quickly established new lines of defense, joining the city's defenders in repelling the undead. Despite the grueling fight, the tide seemed to be turning, the city now buoyed by hope and determination. The battle continued, each side intent on survival. However, with the arrival of the tanks, the city found its second wind. A renewed will to live surged through Lancaster. For the undead, retreat was not an option. For the city, failure meant death. The fight was still far from over, but now there was hope. The city would stand its ground. It would fight until the dawn, and it would survive. As the city battled fiercely against the undead, another wave of horror had silently slipped into the heart of the city, targeting the most vulnerable. The city's hospitals, teeming with the injured and the sick, had become the new epicenter of the outbreak. Inside the hospitals, doctors and nurses worked tirelessly, their focus on saving lives. The sudden intrusion of the undead went unnoticed at first, the terror of their presence drowned out by the urgency of their work. But the silence was short-lived. Soon, the screams echoed through the hospital corridors, the metallic smell of blood overpowering the sterile scent of disinfectant. Back at the garage, the night watch's radio crackled to life, an urgent message interrupting the battle reports. Undead incursion at the hospitals. We need assistance. The voice was laced with panic, the underlying terror resonating through the radio waves. Immediately, a detachment of Night Watch, led by a seasoned hunter named Gabriel, leapt into action. They raced through the beleaguered city, their motorcycles cutting through the night like vengeful wraiths. As they approached the hospital, the gravity of the situation became evident. Swarms of undead had invaded the hospital, the once sanctuary now turned into a battlefield. The Night Watch detachment charged in without hesitation, their weapons roaring to life. Every corner of the hospital was a scene of chaos and horror. The undead had infiltrated every ward, every corridor. The injured and the healers were both victims now. But as Night Watch fought back, room by room, floor by floor, they began to reclaim the hospital. It was a gruesome fight, the hospital's white walls now splattered with the dark stains of combat. The Night Watch moved methodically, covering each other's backs, their tactics and camaraderie forged in countless encounters with the undead. Despite the horrific situation, there was a glimmer of hope. Survivors were found hidden in rooms and closets, their faces etched with relief at the sight of their rescuers. The Night Watch kept pushing forward, their resolve unyielding, their mission clear: save the survivors, and purge the hospital of the undead. Their determination to protect the city and its people was undeterred, even in the face of this terrifying outbreak. The battle was far from over, but with every undead they put down, the hospital inched closer to being safe once more. The city, as if caught in the middle of an unforgiving storm, was under siege. Amidst the chaos, a distress call echoed through the emergency channels. The last bastion of order, the Lancaster City Police Station, was under attack. The once robust precinct now echoed with the screams of the damned and the defiant roars of the last few officers making their stand. Upon hearing the distress call, Johnny, now known as the Duke, felt a knot tighten in his stomach. The police station was not just a symbol of order, it had been his lifeline, his source of connection to the world before. Without wasting a moment, he grabbed his trusty .44 Magnum and darted across the rooftops towards the besieged station. Back at the police station, the remaining officers formed a tight circle, backs against each other, guns blazing. They stood their ground, their faces etched with determination and fear. But as the undead continued their relentless advance, their numbers started to dwindle. Then, like a bolt from the heavens, the Duke arrived. His eyes, glowing in the darkness, scanned the scene, the .44 Magnum in his hand gleaming ominously. He was a specter of vengeance, an avenger of the night, ready to push back the darkness threatening to consume the precinct. The Duke joined the desperate fight, his .44 Magnum a thunderous announcement of his arrival. The undead, momentarily thrown off by his appearance, hesitated. This break was all the remaining officers needed. Rallying together, they found renewed vigor and pushed back, their gunfire a symphony of survival in the heart of the beleaguered city. The fight was brutal and raw, an epitome of humanity's last stand against the undead. The station echoed with gunshots and snarls, every corner a testament to the gruesome battle taking place. Yet, the Duke and the remaining officers held their ground, their resolve unwavering, their spirits unbowed. As the night wore on, the battle intensified. The police station, once a symbol of law and order, was now a fortress against the undead. The Duke and the remaining officers, standing shoulder to shoulder, held the line. Despite their dwindling numbers, they refused to surrender, determined to protect what was left of their city and their humanity. The battle for the police station was far from over, the final outcome still uncertain. But one thing was clear, they would fight until their last breath. The city of Lancaster was drowning in shadows, a horrifying tableau of what used to be a vibrant city now overrun by the undead. The Duke, Night Watch, and the remaining officers fought on, holding their ground with the grit and tenacity of the damned. The once mighty M1 Abrams, their steel hulls echoing with the roars of defiance, now lay toppled and silent, a grim testament to the unyielding tide of the undead. The Duke, his .44 Magnum roaring in his hand, fired round after round into the encroaching horde. His eyes, glowing in the eerie darkness, were filled with a furious determination. Beside him, the remaining officers of the Lancaster police fired their weapons, their faces hardened masks of desperation and resolve. In the distance, the Night Watch fought their own battles. Their weapons, like voices in a terrible choir, added to the cacophony of the night. Their figures, illuminated by the harsh, flickering street lights, seemed like ghostly avengers, ethereal and unyielding. The undead were everywhere. They swarmed the streets, toppled barricades, and overran defenses. Their snarls and groans were a terrible symphony that echoed in the chilling night. Every corner of Lancaster was steeped in horror, each street a theater of the macabre. Hope was a fading ember in the terrifying darkness. It seemed as if the night would never end, the city forever trapped in this relentless onslaught. And then, just when despair seemed to tighten its cold grip around the city, the skies roared. The thunderous chop of rotors broke through the symphony of the undead. Squinting against the darkness, the Duke, Night Watch, and the police watched as squadrons of A-64E Apache attack helicopters descended from the sky. The sight was like a glimmer of dawn at the end of a horrifyingly long night. With their twin turboshaft engines roaring, the Apaches sliced through the darkness, their deadly arsenal pointed towards the undead horde. It was as if angels of retribution had descended upon Lancaster, their wrathful gaze focused on the monstrosities that had claimed the city. As the first rays of dawn started to break through the ghastly gloom, the battle for Lancaster was far from over. But the arrival of the Apaches had reignited the ember of hope. The Duke, Night Watch, and the police stood tall, their faces hardened with newfound determination. They were ready to reclaim their city, to push back the night and let the dawn break through. As the first rays of dawn stretched across the battle-ridden city, an eerie silence fell over Lancaster. The incessant groans of the undead and the constant crackle of gunfire had become the city's horrifying lullaby. But the dawn didn't bring the quiet peace they had so yearned for, it was just the calm before another storm. The undead were still there, crawling out of the shadows, their grotesque figures outlined in the soft morning light. They seemed unfazed by the rising sun, their relentless pursuit for the living undeterred. Their monstrous silhouettes painted a grim picture against the backdrop of the dawning day, turning the promising sunrise into a scene of harrowing dread. Amid the morning fog, the Duke and the Night Watch stood, wearied yet undeterred, their weapons glistening under the dawn's light. Their faces were marked with a night's worth of struggle, their spirits buoyed only by the burning desire to protect their city. The remaining officers, few but resolute, joined them. Their badges glinted in the nascent light, their uniforms stained with the evidence of the night-long battle. Their eyes, though heavy with fatigue, shone with a determination that was stronger than ever. As the A-64E Apaches soared overhead, their blades chopping through the morning air, a renewed sense of hope surged through the ranks of the living. Their deafening roar was no longer just a harbinger of war but also a call to arms for those ready to reclaim their city. The undead continued their advance, their grotesque forms illuminated in the dawn's soft light. But now, they were not just fighting against the humans, they were challenging the dawn itself, a struggle against nature's indomitable cycle. Gunfire erupted once again, the first volleys of a new day's battle. The Apaches swooped down, their devastating armaments turning large swaths of the undead into nothing but dust. The ground shook with each explosion, the shockwaves rattling the bones of the city. But this was only the beginning. As the new day dawned on Lancaster, so did a renewed will to fight, to push back the nightmarish tide and reclaim their city from the jaws of the undead. With the Duke and the Night Watch leading the battle, the city was ready to fight until the last undead fell. It was a grim morning, but it was theirs, and they would fight to keep it that way. The battle for Lancaster was far from over. As the dawn broke, it didn't bring peace, but it did bring hope. The night had been long, filled with horrors that would haunt them for a lifetime, but the dawn was theirs. And they would fight, with all they had, to keep the daylight in Lancaster. High above the bloody battleground of Lancaster County, a sleek jet from the National Center for Disease Control and Prevention, NCDCP, cut through the sky. The crew aboard was comprised of some of the brightest minds in virology, tasked with understanding this horrifying evolution. Their equipment was the most advanced the world had to offer, capable of collecting and analyzing data in real time. The jet was loaded with state-of-the-art surveillance equipment, capable of producing high-resolution scans that penetrated deep into the Earth, revealing clusters of the evolved creatures hidden from plain sight. High above the tumultuous scene unfolding in Lancaster, the jet offered a grim perspective on the horrifying extent of the evolution. As they swept over Pennsylvania, their readouts began to churn out unsettling data. There was a noticeable uptick in evolved creature activity, not just in Lancaster, but in cities, towns, and even isolated rural areas across the state. The evolution wasn't just contained within Lancaster County, it was spreading, proliferating in the dense forests and teeming cities of Pennsylvania. This data gave a chilling new perspective. The evolution wasn't slowing down. It was accelerating, transforming the unsuspecting inhabitants of the state into monstrous beings. And most frightening of all was the unpredictability of it all. There seemed to be no pattern, no trigger, just a sudden transformation, as if some ancient genetic switch had been flipped. Suddenly, the epidemic in Lancaster wasn't an isolated incident. It was the first ripple in a vast, dark ocean, hinting at a coming tidal wave that could wash over the entire state. Back in Lancaster, the jet's disturbing findings were communicated to the ground forces, adding a new layer of urgency to their desperate fight. The scope of their battle was now much larger than Lancaster. It was a fight for all of Pennsylvania, possibly for all of humanity. The situation was dire. There was no cure, no vaccine, and only a dim understanding of the evolution. All they had was their courage, their determination, and their unwavering resolve to stand their ground. For now, that was all they needed. The news from the jet only served to fuel their resistance. This was their home, their state, their world, and they would fight to the end to protect it. As the jet disappeared into the horizon, their battle cry echoed across Lancaster, carrying their promise to stand against the coming storm. The fight was far from over, but their resolve was unbroken. They would stand their ground, fight the encroaching darkness, and light a beacon of hope for the rest of Pennsylvania. Over the past several days, the battle for Lancaster raged on with brutal intensity. The Duke, the fearless vigilante who had become the beacon of hope for the beleaguered city, was a blur of motion in the heart of it all. He fought tooth and nail, his burning eyes mirroring the sheer defiance and determination that had come to define the city's stand against the evolved. The city around him was a war zone. The once bustling streets were now overrun by the undead, buildings transformed into fortresses, cars into barricades. The eerie silence of the night was shattered by the deafening sounds of gunfire, the guttural roars of the evolved, and the desperate shouts of the defenders. While Lancaster held its ground, the rest of Pennsylvania had descended into chaos. Cities had been besieged, highways jammed with abandoned vehicles, homes left vacant, their occupants either transformed or fleeing the outbreak. The state had transformed into a giant battlefield, where the line between man and monster blurred with each passing day. Finally, after 3 long days of relentless fighting, the Duke's allies forced him to retreat. He had been at the forefront of every skirmish, his body and mind pushed to the limit. His friends, seeing the toll the unending combat had taken on him, insisted he rest. With a burning protest in his eyes, he acquiesced, retreating to the safe haven they had established in the parking garage. Collapsing onto a makeshift bed, his body finally gave in to exhaustion. His eyes flickered shut, the green glow dimming as sleep claimed him. All around him, the battle raged on. But for a few precious hours, the Duke was allowed a moment's respite, a brief escape from the nightmares that had consumed his city and his life. Unseen to him, his allies watched over him, their faces etched with worry and respect. They knew their fight was far from over, but they also knew they couldn't do it without their Duke. As the battle for Lancaster persisted, echoes of chaos and mayhem could be heard across the entirety of Pennsylvania. The state had turned into a vast, war-ridden landscape where fear reigned supreme. In Philadelphia, once teeming with life and vibrancy, the city of brotherly love had transformed into a city of dread. The iconic Liberty Bell no longer rang out freedom but instead seemed to toll a death knell as throngs of undead moved through its historic streets. Its mighty skyscrapers became makeshift fortresses, their once gleaming glass panes now reflecting the horrors of the city's plight. To the west, Pittsburgh stood equally besieged. The formidable confluence of the Ohio, Allegheny, and Monongahela rivers, once a symbol of the city's resilience and industry, now served as a natural moat against the relentless undead. The city's famed steel bridges transformed into battlegrounds, the clanging of weapons against steel resounding alongside the chilling roars of the evolved. Harrisburg, the state capital, had fallen into panic. The impressive state capitol complex, with its green-domed structure and grand marble staircase, had become a military outpost. Its grand hallways echoed not with legislative debates but the frantic coordination of defense strategies. Erie, nestled on the banks of its namesake lake, was fighting a two-front battle. While soldiers and citizens fought back the undead hordes on land, they had to combat the chaos of mass evacuation attempts by sea, all while the haunting groans of the undead echoed across the waters. Across Pennsylvania, smaller towns and communities like Allentown, Reading, and Scranton faced their own nightmares. Each day was a struggle for survival, each night a chilling reminder of the horror that had befallen them. The undying hope and resilience of Pennsylvanians were put to the ultimate test as they faced their darkest hour. The cacophony of battle echoing in the distance was drowned out by the piercing ringing of the Duke's alarm clock. As his eyes fluttered open, he found himself staring at the familiar figure of a CDC doctor, her face masked, but eyes displaying a mixture of urgency and hope. "Duke, we need you," she stated, her voice barely audible over the clamor of combat outside. Rising groggily, Johnny, the Duke, acknowledged her with a tired nod. He had only just managed to steal a few hours of sleep, yet he knew the importance of his role. As a night prowler, one of the few who had not just survived but seemed to thrive after exposure to the evolutionary virus, his blood, his genes, could hold answers to halting the monstrous evolution of the undead. "The others, they're still out there, fighting," he said, pulling on his combat boots, his gaze flickering to the blurred scene of chaos outside the makeshift lab set up in his old home, the repurposed loom mill. "What's the plan, Doc?" She started outlining the procedure, a complex sequence of tests they had been developing, hoping to isolate and analyze the specific traits in his DNA responsible for his unique abilities and resistance. "This could be our breakthrough, Duke," she emphasized, her eyes brimming with anticipation. "But even if we are correct, and we can create a viable solution, it may take another year or two. This is evolution we're up against, Duke. Turning back its hand is no small feat," she warned, her tone turning serious. Johnny nodded, his face a stoic mask. He understood the gravity of the situation and the significance of his role. Despite the chaos that reigned outside and the daunting odds they were up against, he knew he had to continue fighting, not just on the battleground, but in the lab as well. They needed him. Pennsylvania needed him. The world needed him. The Duke was ready. The next phase of their fight against the undead evolution had just begun. The doctor ushered Johnny into a sanitized room, filled with an assortment of medical equipment. Chrome surfaces gleamed under the harsh fluorescent light, lending a clinical aura to the space. A table sat in the middle, surrounded by various machines, their screens flashing with information too complex for any layman. The doctor helped him onto the table, reassuring him with a steady hand on his shoulder. "We're going to start with a blood test, Duke," she said, her voice steady and calming amidst the metallic hum of the machines. Drawing a vial of his blood, she placed it into a centrifuge, her gloved hands moving with precise, practiced movements. As the machine whirred to life, she turned back to Johnny, preparing him for the next step. A DNA swab, a series of neurological exams, cognitive assessments, they were going to understand his transformation on every conceivable level. Hours turned into days as they pored over the results, comparing Johnny's data to those of the undead, searching for the minute genetic variations that caused such drastically different outcomes. This was evolution in real time, a genetic lottery where the prize was survival or doom. As the days wore on, Johnny spent most of his time hooked up to machines, contributing samples of various types, while the world outside continued its relentless fight. Nights were filled with the distant roars of the undead, the gunfire, and the ceaseless whir of helicopter blades overhead. It was a jarring soundtrack, a constant reminder of the stakes. The days in the lab were grueling. Johnny, despite being the Duke, the night prowler, the hero of Lancaster, was still human. His body ached, his head pounded, but he held on, his resilience fueled by the hope that his sacrifice could lead to a breakthrough. Every drop of blood drawn, every swab taken, every moment of discomfort was a step towards understanding this terrifying evolution and, hopefully, finding a way to stop it. Even if it took a year or two, Johnny was ready to endure. Because in the grand scheme of things, it wasn't just about surviving the night, it was about securing the future of humanity. After 5 grueling days, the doctors finally concluded their tests on Johnny. Pale and drained, Johnny was beginning to feel like a human pincushion, punctured and probed. As the doctors gave him a moment to rest, they hurried to a corner of the room, huddled around a laptop, discussing the data they'd collected. The atmosphere was charged with a sense of cautious optimism. Suddenly, a blood-curdling scream rang through the hospital, the sound chilling Johnny to the bone. His tired eyes widened, immediately alert, his instincts kicking in. The screams were followed by the unmistakable guttural growls of the undead. The doctors froze, their eyes wide with fear. "Code Black," one of the guards yelled through the hospital's intercom system, a panic-stricken voice echoing through the halls. The hospital was under attack. The clinical calm of the room was shattered as Johnny leapt off the table, his exhaustion momentarily forgotten. Adrenaline surged through him, fueling his muscles. He was a night prowler, evolved for this fight. He glanced at the terrified doctors. "Get your data and hide. I'll handle this." The medical staff quickly gathered their precious research, securing the hard drives and notes as Johnny made his way toward the chaos. He could hear the guards struggling to hold back the undead, their terrified screams intermixed with the sounds of gunshots. The hospital, a sanctuary in the middle of this war zone, was being overrun. But they had the data, the potential key to fight this terrifying evolution. As the Duke, Johnny knew it was his duty to protect it, to ensure it reached the outside world. His muscles tightened, his senses heightened, and his green eyes glowed with determination under the flickering hospital lights. The war for survival continued. The battle for survival was a gruesome spectacle. All over the city, once peaceful streets were turned into battlefields as the undead clashed with the remaining forces. The Duke, a beacon of hope among the survivors, had to lead the charge. He rallied the Night Watch, coordinating the defense and using their enhanced abilities to protect those who could not protect themselves. A group of the undead managed to break through the western perimeter. In response, a squadron of Night Watch members sped to the location, tearing through the undead. The relentless assault of the undead seemed to never end. One wave was met and beaten, only for another to rise in its place. In the city center, the M1 Abrams tanks became fortresses against the undead onslaught. The remaining police officers, now well versed in fighting the undead, shot with deadly accuracy, their faces etched with grim determination. Elsewhere, the sound of helicopter blades whirred over the noise of the ongoing battle. The A-64E attack helicopters strafed through the skies, providing crucial air support. The powerful 30mm chain guns spat death from above, mowing down the undead who had managed to breach the city's defensive lines. The Duke, now recovered from his intensive testing, was back on the front lines. Every ounce of his being was devoted to the fight, his body moving in a deadly dance of survival. His evolved abilities were being pushed to the limit as he fought wave after wave of the undead. But the sun was beginning to rise, and for the first time in days, there was a lull in the fighting. The undead, it seemed, were momentarily pushed back, giving the exhausted defenders a respite. The battle was not over, and the war was far from won. But they had survived the night. As dawn broke, painting the sky with hues of orange and purple, there was a momentary calm in the city. The fight would go on, but for now, the living could take a breath, regroup, and prepare for the next onslaught. Johnny was caught off guard by a particularly vicious group of the undead. They were more savage, more relentless than the others he had fought so far. Their decaying teeth sank into his flesh more than once, each bite sending a jolt of pain through his body. Yet, Johnny fought on, the pain only making him more determined. With each bite, he felt a surge of energy, a primal force pushing him closer to the edge. He felt something within him change, his body reacting to the numerous bites, adapting and evolving. A savage, wild fury ignited in him, but he held on, refusing to let the animal within take over. As the battle raged on, his consciousness began to waver. Images flickered through his mind, visions of places he'd never been, memories he'd never lived. He saw wastelands and towering structures, heard strange noises, voices echoing around him. A different world, a different him. He was in a place that was both familiar and utterly alien to him. He saw himself, but it wasn't him, not the Johnny he knew. This Johnny wore a different outfit, fought different battles, against different enemies. He was strong, brave, unyielding, much like himself, yet somehow different. This was not his life, yet he lived it. This was not his world, yet he felt at home. It was as if he was straddling two different existences, a duality that sent a shiver of confusion and recognition through him. But he didn't have time to ponder on the visions now. The fight was still on, and he had to focus on the present, on the real, on the fight in front of him. He pushed the strange visions aside, channeling all his energy into holding back the tide of the undead. As he battled on, the sun began to rise, casting long shadows over the battlefield. The fight was far from over, but Johnny, the Duke, the night prowler, was ready. Despite the bites, despite the confusing visions, he was ready to do whatever it took to ensure the survival of his city and its people. His fight was far from over. The echoes of another life, another him, would have to wait. The Duke fought on, his body moving in a rhythm born from months of relentless battle. His vision flickered again and he was somewhere else, yet he fought on, as though he had one foot in this world, and the other somewhere far removed. He saw a wasteland stretched out before him. A desolate, barren expanse of destruction and despair. He saw himself, or a version of himself, looking out across the vast, ruined landscape. He was standing on a rocky outcrop, a makeshift weapon in his hand, eyes piercing through the endless dark. It was the same vision as before, but somehow more intense, more real. He saw people, if they could be called that, disfigured, brutal, their faces twisted with rage and hunger. They were not the undead he knew, but something different, something more terrifying. He saw towering structures made of scrap metal and junk, makeshift homes in the middle of the barren land. He saw symbols he couldn't understand, an eagle, a gear, a sword, emblazoned on banners and uniforms. Groups of people gathered under these symbols, fighting, struggling, surviving. There was a sense of order amidst the chaos, factions vying for control, for survival. He saw flashes of a strange procedure, a memory that wasn't his own. He was lying on a cold, hard table, the sterile scent of a medical facility filling his nose. He remembered fear, anticipation, and then darkness. And when he woke up, the world was brighter, clearer, as though the night had turned into day. He saw battles, endless and brutal. He saw himself standing strong amidst the chaos, a beacon of hope, a symbol of defiance. He saw sacrifices, loss, victories, and defeats. He saw a world struggling to survive, to find a sense of normalcy in the midst of despair. But as clear as these visions were, they remained vague, as though he was looking through a foggy window. He knew these images, these memories weren't his own, yet he felt a connection, a sense of familiarity that was hard to shake off. These visions were terrifying, but they also filled him with a fierce determination. He couldn't let his world become the one he saw in his visions. He couldn't let the undead take over, couldn't let his world descend into chaos and despair. Whatever it took, he would fight, for himself, for his people, for his world. And so, the visions continued, each more vivid and terrifying than the last. He found himself in a city, its towering buildings reduced to crumbling ruins. He was moving through the desolate streets, his footsteps echoing in the eerie silence. He could see himself, or rather, his other self, prowling through the rubble-strewn streets, ever vigilant, ready to face the horrors that lurked in the shadows. The sense of despair was palpable, a heavy weight that threatened to crush him. He saw himself in a room filled with flickering monitors and buzzing machinery. A cold, mechanical hand reached out, a strange device clasped in its grip. He could feel the cold metal against his skin, the sharp sting as the device was pressed into his flesh, the rush of pain followed by an inexplicable sense of empowerment. The visions showed him endless battles against strange creatures. There were beasts with maws too large for their grotesque bodies, creatures with scales and spines, others with multiple eyes that glowed with an eerie light. Each encounter, each fight was a desperate struggle for survival, a test of his resolve and strength. Then came the vision of a massive structure, a fortress built from scrap and ruin. He could see himself at the helm, leading a group of hardened survivors against an army of the monstrous creatures. There was fire, there was blood, and above all, there was determination. Through these visions, he saw factions and tribes, survivors and warriors, madmen and saviors. He saw people, humans, holding on to their humanity against all odds. He saw himself, or this other self, fighting, not just for survival, but for a chance to rebuild, to start anew. The visions were a cacophony of images, sounds, and emotions, all whirling together in his mind. But amidst the chaos and the horror, he found purpose. The other world was a warning, a terrifying glimpse of what could be if they failed. And it only strengthened his resolve. For the sake of his world, for the sake of the people he swore to protect, he would not let this future come to pass. He would fight, with every last ounce of strength, every last breath, to keep his world from becoming the one he saw in his visions. He would stand against the undead, against the darkness, until the very end. In a particularly intense vision, Johnny found himself in a dusty, abandoned street. His other self stood opposite him, a figure mirroring his own. The setting sun cast long shadows that danced on the derelict buildings around them. A cold wind whistled through the deserted streets, carrying with it the echoes of a world that once was. Both figures stood still, their eyes locked. Each held a weapon in their hands, a glinting .44 Magnum, its polished surface reflecting the dying light. The weapons, though identical, seemed to tell different stories. The one in Johnny's hand was roughened from constant use, its surface marred with scratches from countless battles. The one held by his other self, however, gleamed with an almost unnatural sheen, untouched by the harsh realities of their world. As the tension between the two figures grew, Johnny could sense a sudden shift. It wasn't aggression, it wasn't fear. It was recognition, understanding, a mutual acknowledgement of the burden they both shared. And then, as if triggered by an unseen signal, both figures moved. The sound of their magnums echoed through the empty streets, a resounding symphony of power and determination. For a moment, time seemed to stop, the outcome of their standoff hanging in the balance. When reality snapped back, both figures still stood, their magnums lowered, the echoes of their standoff slowly fading away. Johnny could feel an unspoken connection between them, a shared resolve echoing across realities. They were both soldiers, fighters standing against the tide of darkness, bound by their shared destiny. As the vision faded, Johnny found himself back in his world, the sound of the gunfire and the roar of the undead filling his ears. But the echo of that standoff remained, a silent vow reverberating in his mind. He wouldn't let his world succumb to the darkness. He wouldn't let his reality become the one he saw in his visions. This mysterious encounter, though vague and indistinct, only solidified Johnny's resolve. His other self, the figure from the visions, was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. And Johnny intended to honor that spirit, no matter the cost. The heavy, rhythmic thumping of helicopter blades slicing through the air echoed in the distance, growing louder and more insistent. A rumbling, like a distant thunderstorm, rolled over the city as an armada of Humvees rumbled down the streets. The sounds were punctuated by the sharp whistles of command and the screeching of radio feedback. Johnny emerged from the bowels of the hospital, his wounds bandaged, and his body aching. Above him, the sky was a maelstrom of activity as dozens of Apache helicopters whirred overhead. On the ground, M1 Abrams tanks rolled through the streets, their turrets swiveling as they searched for their undead targets. Squads of soldiers clad in full tactical gear moved with precision, their faces set with grim determination. "We've got company," Johnny muttered, a small smile playing on his lips as he watched the armored battalion storm the city. He adjusted his grip on his trusty .44 Magnum, his eyes scanning the perimeter. He wasn't alone anymore. The might of the U.S. Army had finally arrived. And yet, amidst the symphony of war, there was a strange sense of calmness within him. It was the calm before the storm, a silence that whispered promises of the imminent violence and destruction. It was a silence that Johnny knew all too well. For the next several hours, Lancaster City turned into a war zone. Helicopters swooped down from the sky, unleashing their payloads onto hordes of undead. Tanks rolled over the lifeless bodies, crushing them under their heavy treads. Soldiers engaged in close-quarter combat, their rifles barking as they pushed back the horde. Meanwhile, Johnny, the Duke of Lancaster, and the Night Watch were in the thick of the fight. The visions of the other world, the one of desolation and survival, ignited a spark of determination within him. Each undead he put down was a step towards ensuring that his world wouldn't turn into the bleak reality of his visions. Through the chaos and the cacophony of war, Johnny fought, fueled by the strength of his conviction. He would fight, he would survive, and he would protect his world from turning into the nightmare he had seen. No matter what, he would not let the undead win. The continuous cacophony of war waged on, each day blurring into the next. The nights were punctuated by the sound of gunshots and the drone of helicopters, and the days were bathed in the eerie glow of a city on fire. However, the battle began to take a turn. Johnny and the Night Watch fought with unyielding ferocity, their intimate knowledge of the city streets and the behaviors of the undead giving them an edge. But it was the combined force of the U.S. Army that tipped the scale. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, the undead were being pushed back. The city, once teeming with the mindless infected, began to clear. Street by street, block by block, the U.S. Army pushed the undead out of Lancaster. In a few blood-soaked days, a monumental change occurred. The battered and tired soldiers, along with the local law enforcement and Night Watch, managed to establish a perimeter around the city. Sniper posts were established on rooftops, barricades were erected in the streets, and constant patrols were initiated. Lancaster City, once the epicenter of the undead nightmare, was now a fortified sanctuary amid the horrors outside. In the days that followed, the city saw more changes. Abandoned buildings were transformed into temporary housing for the soldiers and civilians. Food and medical supplies were airdropped regularly. Clean water was a luxury, but at least they had enough to survive. The city started to breathe again, the grim determination of its defenders birthing a sense of hope in its inhabitants. Johnny, despite his exhaustion, felt a surge of relief. Lancaster, the city he had vowed to protect, was safe again. But his heart ached for the rest of Pennsylvania. This victory was a beacon of hope, but the war was far from over. As he looked out over the city from his perch atop the fortified police station, he knew they still had a long way to go. But for now, they had won a crucial battle. The undead had been pushed back, and Lancaster City was a safe zone. The next few days passed in a solemn haze as the city prepared to honor the lives lost in the battle against the undead. The open ground beside the newly fortified police station was chosen as the site for the commemoration, transformed into a sea of candles as dusk fell. Hundreds of people gathered, huddled in clusters, their faces illuminated by the soft, flickering light. Each held a candle, a tiny beacon of remembrance against the encroaching darkness. A makeshift stage had been set up, its crude simplicity a stark reminder of the world they now lived in. The ceremony began with a moment of silence. A heavy stillness hung in the air, the gathered crowd taking a collective breath as they honored their fallen friends and family. This silence was not an absence of sound, but a tangible presence, a soundless symphony of grief and loss that resonated with everyone present. Then, the names began to be read. Each one rang out clearly in the quiet night, a somber tolling bell marking the passage of those they had lost. Among these were the names of nearly half the Night Watch team. Brave individuals who had taken up the mantle of protection when their city needed them the most. As the last name was read, a profound sadness washed over the crowd, their collective grief palpable in the still night air. But interspersed with this grief was a sense of fierce determination, a resolve to ensure that these losses were not in vain. Johnny stood, feeling the weight of each name that was read aloud. friends, comrades, people he had fought alongside. He looked around at the sea of candles, each one a small testament to a life cut short, their collective glow fighting back against the darkness. The funeral ended with a chorus of voices singing a hymn of remembrance. The notes rose and fell, a poignant melody carried on the night breeze. As the last notes faded into the night, people began to disperse, each carrying their candle with them, a piece of the collective light they had created together. The city had lost much, but they had also gained a sense of unity, a shared determination, a bond forged in the fires of shared adversity. The loss of their comrades had shaken them, but it had also strengthened their resolve to keep fighting, to keep surviving, in their memory. As Johnny walked away from the ceremony, he looked back at the field of candles one last time. Their light flickered against the night, a steadfast reminder of the lives lost and a beacon of hope for the battles to come. The next day, a tall, grey wall was erected beside the police station, standing tall and proud against the backdrop of the battle-scarred city. The Wall of Remembrance, they called it, and its purpose was simple, to forever etch in stone the names of those who had given their lives to keep Lancaster safe. Cranes and other heavy machinery, remnants of a world before the outbreak, were repurposed to lift the massive slabs of concrete into place. The whole city seemed to hold its breath as the wall was constructed, an odd silence falling over the crowd of onlookers. Upon its completion, a single artist began the painstaking task of inscribing the names of the fallen. Using a set of diamond-tipped engraving tools, he carefully chiseled each name into the concrete, each letter a testament to their sacrifice. The artist worked tirelessly through the day and into the night, his dedication echoing the spirit of the city's lost defenders. As the list of names grew, citizens gathered, their eyes scanning the growing list of names. Tears were shed, stories shared, and in some cases, quiet laughter rang out as cherished memories were recalled. It was a collective catharsis, a chance to share in their grief, but also in their pride. One by one, the names of the fallen members of Night Watch were inscribed into the wall. Seeing these names etched in stone, their sacrifices made real and tangible, it was a sight that stirred the heart. These were not just names, they were reminders of courage, determination, and selflessness, traits that had become the cornerstone of their survival. When the last name was finally inscribed, the crowd gathered in silence. The Wall of Remembrance now stood complete, a solemn tribute to their fallen heroes. People began to leave tokens of remembrance at the base of the wall, turning it into a makeshift shrine. Flowers, photos, handwritten letters, and other mementos formed a colorful tapestry at the base of the wall. As dusk fell, the wall was illuminated, the names of the fallen glowed, standing out in stark relief against the concrete. It was a sight that struck a chord in everyone present. The Wall of Remembrance was a testament to their loss, but it was also a symbol of their resilience, a monument to their defiance against the darkness. Johnny Vanjik looked upon the wall, his heart heavy yet filled with a renewed determination. The sight of those names etched in stone, immortalizing the brave men and women who had stood by his side, was a powerful reminder of the stakes they were fighting for. They were not just defending their city, they were fighting for their fallen comrades, for their memory, for their legacy. It was a fight they could not, would not, afford to lose. Johnny Vanjik stood on the rooftop of the former police station, looking out at the city of Lancaster. The fires had been quenched, the barricades had been fortified, and the survivors had started to rebuild. The city was bruised, but it was not broken. However, the fight was far from over. Outside the city walls, the rest of Pennsylvania was still a battleground. The thought stirred a fire within him. He knew his duty was not done, his fight was not yet over. With the memories of the past few months vivid in his mind, he prepared for his next journey. The hunters and the remaining members of Night Watch would hold down the fort, protecting the people of Lancaster, while he ventured into the undead-ridden state. He turned to look at the Wall of Remembrance one last time. The faces of those who had perished in the fight for their city imprinted in his mind. Each one of them a constant reminder of the cost of this war, and the price of failure. Fueled by a grim determination, he packed his gear, weapons, food, medical supplies. He had survived the harshest months of the epidemic, fought off hordes of the undead, and he was prepared to do it all again. To him, there was no other option. He was a hunter, a survivor, a beacon of hope in a world consumed by darkness. He was the Duke. As the dawn broke over Lancaster, Johnny Vanjik was ready to set off. He took one last look at the safe haven they had managed to create amidst the chaos. This city was a symbol of their resilience, a testament to their survival. But out there, in the rest of Pennsylvania, people were still fighting, still struggling, still hoping for a savior. And he was ready to be just that. With a last nod to the men and women of Night Watch, he slipped into the wilderness, his heart filled with a relentless determination. He knew the road ahead would be fraught with danger and uncertainty, but there was no turning back now. He was ready to bring the fight to the undead, ready to reclaim their world. His journey was just beginning. And he was ready for whatever the world would throw at him. The Duke was on the move, and nothing would stand in his way. As Johnny Vanjik, known as the Duke, made his way into Millersville, he could see that the once vibrant town was now a shadow of its former self. Streets that once bustled with students were now eerily quiet, and the towering structure of Penn Manor High School stood as a grim reminder of what was lost. The Duke had been traveling for several hours, constantly vigilant for any signs of the undead. From his experiences in Lancaster, he knew all too well the cunning and resilience these creatures possessed. As he neared the school, he observed the grim spectacle that lay before him. The football field was overrun with the undead, roaming aimlessly or pounding on the doors of the school, where survivors might still be hiding. It was an unsettling sight, but the Duke knew what he had to do. With a deep breath, he stepped forward, brandishing his weapons. His glowing eyes focused on the horde before him, a grim resolve set on his face. The following hours were a blur of adrenaline and chaos. He moved with the skill and precision of a seasoned hunter, his every step calculated, his every move deadly. He fought tirelessly, his weapons a mere blur as he dispatched the undead one by one. He was a whirlwind of devastation in the midst of the horde, carving a path through the sea of undead. By the time night fell, the high school grounds were silent once more, littered with the bodies of the fallen undead. The Duke, battered and bloody but unbroken, stood victorious. He had managed to reclaim Penn Manor High School. As he surveyed the scene, he couldn't help but mourn the lives that had been lost, the dreams that had been shattered, and the innocence that had been stolen. But amidst the sorrow, there was a glimmer of hope, a testament to the enduring spirit of humanity. Exhausted yet undeterred, the Duke pressed on, aware that this was just one of the many battles he would have to fight. His journey had only just begun, and he was ready to face whatever lay ahead. Word had gotten out about Johnny's arrival in Millersville and his battle at the high school. By the time the military convoy arrived at Penn Manor High School, they found the place eerily silent, save for the occasional creak of settling debris and the haunting echo of lost voices. What was left of the undead lay scattered across the grounds. Broken and beaten, they were the remnants of the army Johnny had single-handedly defeated. They had arrived expecting a fight, but found only the aftermath of one. There, on the exterior brick wall of the school, the military spotted a familiar symbol, a tag spray-painted with a certain rebellious flair, the Duke. The words were written large and clear, a bold testament to Johnny Vanjik's involvement in clearing the school. "Looks like the Duke beat us to it," one of the soldiers remarked with a hint of respect in his voice. They had known of Johnny Vanjik, of course. His work with the CDC and military back in Lancaster had earned him a reputation. The tales of his bravery, his glowing eyes, his resilience to the virus, it had all seemed like stuff of legends. But the cleared high school and the spray-painted tag stood as proof of his reality. In the following days, the military transformed the cleared high school into another safe zone. They fortified the buildings, set up medical tents and started ration distribution. As the safe zone became more established, stories of Johnny Vanjik's heroics spread. The Duke, as he was called, became a beacon of hope amidst the chaos, a symbol of resistance against the undead evolution that ravaged their world. With each new day, his legend grew, carried forward by the whispers of those who found safety within the walls of Penn Manor High School. The setting sun cast long shadows over the quiet town, the orange hue of twilight washing over the cracked and abandoned buildings. The streets were deserted, the undead driven out or hiding, as Johnny Vanjik, known as the Duke, stood before a large, untouched wall. He held a can of spray paint in his hand, its contents rattling with every shake. He started with a circle, wide and encompassing, before adding a horizontal line halfway through and vertical lines jutting from the center. The familiar symbol of a vault, an emblem of the world from his visions, soon adorned the wall. As the last line was etched, he stepped back, observing his work, then added 3 numbers in the center of the design, 717. As he painted the numbers, a wave of vertigo hit him, the world blurring around the edges. It was happening again, another vision. He squeezed his eyes shut, steadying himself against the wall. When he opened them again, it wasn't the wall of the small town in Lancaster County he was looking at, but another scene, another world, another Johnny. This Johnny, hardened by the wastes, clad in a worn outfit, his eyes glowing the same eerie green as his own, stood at a distance. They locked eyes, 2 versions of the same person separated by worlds and realities. In the silence that stretched between them, Johnny could see the weight of a world's hopes resting on this other Johnny's shoulders. It was a burden he recognized all too well. He reached out, the action more instinct than thought. "Who are you?" he asked, voice echoing in the empty space between them. The other Johnny tilted his head, a silent acknowledgement of his words. He then held up a vial, the green liquid inside glowing ominously. It was an echo of their shared reality, a twisted mirror reflecting the virus that had thrown their respective worlds into chaos. Johnny Vanjik didn't need to hear the other Johnny's answer. He understood. The vial, the wasteland, the burden, it was the same story, only told in a different way. As the vision faded, the last thing he saw was the other Johnny's glowing eyes, holding a resilience that mirrored his own. Back in Lancaster County, he stood before the vault symbol he'd painted on the wall. The night had settled in, the quiet only broken by the distant sounds of nocturnal creatures. In the darkness, his eyes glowed an eerie green, mirroring the color of the 717 painted on the wall. The Duke took one last look at the symbol and the numbers on the wall before turning away, leaving it as a silent testament to the fight they were all part of. The 2 Johnnies, the 2 worlds, they were more connected than he could have imagined, and it was a connection he was ready to explore further. As he disappeared into the night, he carried with him the knowledge of his doppelganger in that other world, the echoes of their shared burdens, and the shared fight for survival. The worlds might be different, the circumstances unique, but their fight was the same. And the Duke was just getting started.